Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We begin now with Story 1, The Plague and the Peasant, How the Black Death Broke the Manor. In the year 1347, the feudal structure of Europe was rigid, efficient, and brutally effective. At its core was the manor system, an economic and social arrangement where lords controlled lands and peasants toiled them. In this arrangement, every individual had a place and a purpose, defined by birth, duty, and debt. The peasant, more accurately, the serf, was tied to the land, often unable to leave without permission. Life was repetitive and local. A good harvest could mean marginal comfort, a bad one starvation. You might imagine a village nestled at the edge of a forest in Normandy or Sussex, its thatched roofs sagging under the weight of years. Chickens pecked at mud, and children, though rarely idle, chased one another among the furrows of rye. Most never traveled more than 5 miles from where they were born. They were born in service, lived in toil, and died in obscurity. The manor itself was not just a place, it was a self-contained world. Lords collected rents in labor or produce. The reeve kept records and the bailiff ensured quotas were met. The fields operated on a 3-field system: winter grain, spring grain, and fallow. This meant that each year, some land rested while the others bore the burden of feeding the village and paying dues. Seasons determined rhythms. The plow was sacred, and the sickle was a symbol of both life and death. In this carefully balanced world, the plague did not arrive with a scream, but a whisper. It likely came by ship, through the bustling trade routes that Europe had increasingly relied upon. Genoese traders fleeing the besieged city of Caffa carried the invisible threat. Their bodies bore black swellings under their arms and at the groin buboes. It was 1347. From Messina to Marseille, the disease spread. But let us pause a moment before the wave reaches the English countryside or the hills of France. Before the Black Death, the manorial system was already under pressure. The population had grown considerably in the previous 2 centuries, a phenomenon historians sometimes call the medieval warm period. With more mouths to feed, marginal lands were brought under cultivation. These were less fertile, harder to till, and prone to failure. Yet feudal lords demanded the same from their peasants, regardless of nature's yield. Peasants bore the burden of bad weather, poor harvests, and rising obligations. Even before the plague, famines like the Great Famine of 1315–1317 had exposed the cracks in the system. During that terrible stretch, it rained so much that fields were waterlogged. Food prices doubled, then tripled. Reports from the time mention parents abandoning children, and in some rumors, even darker acts of desperation. So when the plague reached the villages, it found not a robust peasantry but one already worn thin. It found communities that were densely packed, poorly nourished, and without medical understanding of contagion. All that was known were symptoms and death. Imagine a small village of 300 souls. Within weeks, 150 are gone. The church bell tolls continuously. The priest, after burying 20 in a day, falls ill himself. A child wakes to find her parents dead. Fields go untended. The Lord's steward, sent to collect rents, finds doors barred with corpses behind them. Death did not respect status. Lords, knights, priests all fell alongside their peasants, but it was in the countryside where the collapse began in earnest. You see, the manor depended on people, on hands to plow, to sow, to reap. When those hands were gone, the entire mechanism faltered. Across Europe, manors were left without workers. sheep wandered freely, grain spoiled. In some regions, entire villages vanished from the record. Yet something else happened to something subtle. The survivors found themselves in a strange new world. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Fields still needed tilling, but fewer people were there to do it. Suddenly, a peasant's labor had value. Lords began offering better terms to attract workers. Wages, once unheard of in rural contracts, crept into agreements. Serfs began leaving one manor for another that offered better conditions. Though technically illegal, enforcement was nearly impossible. This was not rebellion yet. It was adjustment, quiet movement, a reshaping of the social contract without anyone declaring it. But the upper classes saw it differently. They called it disobedience. They saw peasants wearing finer clothes, eating better food, walking with confidence. In some cases, the peasantry even refused to work unless paid, a concept antithetical to feudal ideology. Governments responded with panic. In England, King Edward III enacted the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal for a worker to leave his master in search of better pay. It was a paper wall against a rising tide. But how do you enforce economic stagnation on a society transformed by mortality? Some lords complied, others ignored the rules and competed for laborers anyway. Local officials turned a blind eye, or they, too, benefited from the shift. The legal system strained, and the traditional rights of nobility were questioned not with pitchforks yet, but with decisions made in quiet moments. To move, to negotiate, to say no. In some areas, peasants began to demand formal contracts. In others, they occupied abandoned lands. The customary dues that had tied them to the land weakened. The plague, though indiscriminate in its wrath, had created an accidental revolution. It had shattered not only bodies but assumptions about who owed whom, about what one's place was in the world. And all of this subtle but profound shift was happening before the full political and social consequences had even begun to appear. So here we sit in the ruins of a manor, the fields half sown, the barns half empty, and the peasantants voiceless wondering. If the world could change this much in a season, what else might now be possible? The year is now 1351. The Black Death has ebbed, but the tremors it set off continue to ripple through the spine of Europe. Crops begin to grow again, though not with the same bounty. Fields long abandoned are reclaimed slowly by surviving tenants and wandering laborers. But something fundamental has shifted. You might not see it at first glance. The village still looks like a village. The manor house still stands, perhaps now emptier. The church remains the tallest building. But listen closely, and the change is audible in the tones of negotiation, in the silence of defiance. The peasants, those who remain, know what their labor is worth. In pre-plague society, wages were an afterthought in rural life. The feudal contract was based not on payment but on obligation. You worked because you had to. You tilled your lord's land in exchange for the right to grow food for your family. Money, if it appeared, was used in towns, in guilds, by merchants. The countryside operated largely in kind and custom. But the plague reduced the European population by as much as 1/3 to 1/2 in some areas. Suddenly, everything was upside down. Labor was scarce. Land was plentiful. And for the first time, supply and demand favored the lower classes. From a purely economic standpoint, this was a classic labor shortage. Landowners, lords, abbots, knights still needed harvests. With fewer workers, many offered better terms to attract survivors. Some offered food or clothing. Others offered cash. Imagine a young man who survived the pestilence, lean and cautious. A manor 2 days' walk away offers coin for plowing. Another village offers tenancy of an abandoned holding. For the first time, his decision matters. He has agency, and in that decision, the old structure begins to loosen. But the ruling class did not watch this change with grace. In England, King Edward I, no stranger to war and debt feared inflation and disorder. The Black Death had just begun to wane when his court issued the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349. This emergency decree froze wages at pre-plague levels and declared it unlawful for a worker to refuse employment or to demand higher pay. In theory, this protected the old order. In practice, it was unenforceable. So in 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, a more permanent version of the same principle. It mandated that all able-bodied persons under 60 must work. Employers could not offer wages higher than those before the plague. Workers could not move to another area without written permission. Any laborer refusing to work at lawful wages could be imprisoned. This was not a policy of guidance, it was a legal barrier, an effort to forcibly restore a world that no longer existed. But laws written in fear rarely succeed in the long term. Let us turn for a moment to the manor of Sir Thomas in Lincolnshire. Before the plague, his fields yielded barley and rye, his peasants numbered 50, and his reeve enforced routine. After 1349, half his tenants had died. The remaining few knew they were valuable. When Sir Thomas posted notices demanding workers return at old wages, only silence answered. He found those who left, but the village court was empty. Some of his former serfs now worked on lands nearby, earning coin. Others had vanished. His bailiff tried to impose fines, but there was no one to pay them. The law existed on parchment, but the power to enforce it had ebbed like the tide. Meanwhile, in the towns, the merchant and artisan classes noticed something too. The cost of goods rose. Tailors demanded more. Bakers charged more for bread. Carpenters negotiated day rates. Wages across trades increased despite royal decrees. For the first time in centuries, economic mobility opened slightly for those previously fixed in place. But this shift was met not only with legal resistance, but also with moral condemnation. Chronicles from the time describe peasants growing insolent, wearing fine clothes, and eating meat too often. To the nobility, this was decadence. To the peasants, it was dignity. In France, similar laws emerged. The Ordinance of 1351 echoed England's efforts. Local lords tried to compel villeins back to their holdings, but enforcement faltered. The chaos of the 100 Years' War only made matters worse, as armies ravaged the countryside, further reducing labor pools and disrupting old loyalties. In Germany, the fragmentation of authority made enforcement uneven. Some lords cracked down harshly, others adapted, offering contracts and encouraging new settlements. One peculiar development across the continent was the reappearance of free labor. In many areas, peasants negotiated temporary work, rather than permanent servitude. This arrangement, known or frowned upon before, became normal. In some places, even the word serf began to fade from legal language. In others, new categories emerged: tenant to twill, copyholder, day laborer, all of them subtly redefining the relationship between land and labor. What about the church, that ever-watchful guardian of morality and order? Clergy were among the most devastated groups during the plague. They ministered to the sick and buried the dead, and in doing so, they too died in great numbers. In some parishes, entire clerical staffs were wiped out. In the aftermath, hastily trained replacements stepped in, sometimes undereducated, sometimes unordained. With the spiritual authority of the church shaken, so too was its control over social norms. Sermons continued to preach obedience, humility, and divine hierarchy. But the people in the pews knew a different truth. God's judgment had not spared the nobility. Death had come for all, and those who survived felt marked not by servitude, but by providence. In one English village, a surviving priest refused to excommunicate a peasant who had refused lordly service. His reasoning: the earth is large and laborers few. Let each find his work where he may. These small acts of defiance equate, unrecorded eroded the spiritual backing of feudalism as surely as any rebellion. By 1360, a strange balance emerged. Laws that no one followed, customs that no longer fit, and a social class awakening to its bargaining power. There were, of course, limits. Not all peasants benefited equally. Some regions remained tightly controlled. In others, famines returned. And not all lords lost control. Many adapted, leasing out land, forming proto-capitalist estates, or selling privileges for cash. But across the landscape, something ancient was dying not with a bang, but with an absence. It is easy to underestimate the power of legal inertia. The feudal system was centuries in the making. It was codified in oaths, in habits, in ceremonies. But those systems relied on people, on compliance, on the illusion of permanence. When death removed half the population, it did more than silence voices. It severed obligations, and no law, however harsh, could resurrect them. The statute of laborers remained on the books in England for decades. Judges cited it. Lords invoked it. But the reality on the ground was different. Laborers demanded more, moved freely, and treated their toil not as debt, but as commodity. And slowly, a new idea took root, that a person's value was not fixed by birth, but by what they could provide. Still, as wages rose and workers moved, another question surfaced, far more troubling to the ruling elite. What happens when peasants realize they don't need the lords at all? By the closing decades of the 14th century, the world of the peasant had changed not overnight, not by proclamation, but by the slow, grinding transformation of necessity. Fields had been reclaimed, villages repopulated, and church bells rang once more not only for funerals, but for weddings, births, and harvest festivals. Life had resumed, but not as it was. Feudal Europe was not broken all at once, but it was undeniably changed. You could hear it in how laborers spoke to stewards. You could see it in contracts where once there were only customs. And you could read it in the legal records of the manorial rolls, once pages of obedience, now laced with defiance, negotiation, and absence. The third and final phase of this story is not a dramatic battle or a thunderous collapse. It is quieter than that. It is about how systems erode not from rebellion, but from disuse. Let us return to the English countryside. By 1370, the manorial court rolls, once full of fines for missing harvest days or brewing beer without permission, show growing gaps. The court still met, but fewer tenants showed up. Lordship, once paternalistic and absolute, became increasingly symbolic. Many lords had died during the plague. Their heirs, sometimes children, sometimes distant cousins, often lacked the authority or desire to enforce ancient rights. Others, pressed by debt from the 100 Years, war, or extravagant living, converted their estates into domain farms leased to tenants for cash. This process commutation meant that instead of working their lord's land for free, peasants now paid a fixed rent. These arrangements suited both sides. Lords gained stable income without the need to manage labor. Peasants, in turn, gained control over their time, their harvests, and most importantly, their futures. By the 1380s, in England alone, manorial land under traditional servile tenure had shrunk dramatically. The shift from customary labor services to monetary rents was underway. But where does a system go when its foundations are gone? Some lords tried to reassert control. In France, after the devastation of the plague and the chaos of the 100 Years' War, rural areas became battlegroundsless of weapons and more of wills. Peasants fled, lands lay fallow, and tax revenues dried up. Nobles leaned harder on the few who remained, demanding dues and services that no longer made sense in a changed economy. In 1358, in northern France, this led to open revolt, the Jacquerie, a desperate and brutal uprising of peasants against their lords. Fueled by hunger, taxation, and rage, they burned manor houses, slaughtered noble families, and declared, however briefly, a rejection of the old world. It was crushed within weeks. But the Jacquerie was only one of several. In 1381, England faced its own reckoning. The Peasants' Revolt, led in part by the enigmatic Wat Tyler, was sparked not only by economic frustrations, but by a third iteration of the poll tax, a regressive flat tax that punished the poor for the sins of the rich. For years, peasants had been slowly gaining power, but the Crown's refusal to acknowledge this and its aggressive taxation ignited a movement. Tens of thousands marched on London. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair wages, and the removal of corrupt officials. They did not speak like the serfs of 1300. They spoke like men who had learned their worth. When they entered London, they behaved not like looters, but like negotiators. They met the king young Richard I and extracted promises. For a brief moment, the dream of a free peasantry seemed close to reality. But the promises were false. Wat Tyler was murdered during a parley. The revolt was put down with swift violence. Reprisals followed, yet something important lingered. Even in its failure, the peasants' revolt revealed that the old order no longer held the same authority. The fear was mutual now. After the revolt, laws against wage increases were reaffirmed. Serfdom was reasserted in paper, but enforcement remained elusive. Lords continued to lease land. Laborers continued to move and negotiate. Serfdom, already rotting, became a legal fiction. By 1400, in most parts of England, traditional serfdom had effectively ended not because it was abolished, but because it was abandoned. In Germany and Eastern Europe, the story played out differently. There, where the plague had been less severe and land was still plentiful, lords doubled down on control. In places like Prussia, Poland, and Bohemia, serfdom hardened into something closer to slavery in the centuries ahead, a phenomenon historians call the Second Serfdom. But in the West, the tide flowed the other way. In France, the devastation of war and plague led many nobles to centralize their holdings. Serfs, like in England, increasingly became tenants. Royal power, rather than noble power, began to rise. Kings imposed taxes, built bureaucracies, and offered protection where lords could not. And therein lies the real birth of the nation-state. As the manor system decayed, people no longer looked to their immediate lords for identity or justice. They looked outward to the crown, to the court, to the town, even to themselves. This was not nationalism in the modern sense. No peasant thought of himself as English or French in the 1300s, but loyalty was being redefined. The king, once a distant figure, became a central authority. Taxes went to him. Laws bore his seal. The army fought in his name. By the 15th century, in England, France, and the Low Countries, we see the emergence of centralized tax systems, standing armies, and royal courts with jurisdiction over vast territories. Feudalism, with its intricate web of oaths and mutual obligations, was replaced with a simpler hierarchy, subject and sovereign. And the peasant. The peasant, for all his toil and silence, played a role in this transformation. By surviving the plague, by asserting his worth, by walking to a better manor, by negotiating a contract, or by marching on London, he helped lay the groundwork for modern Europe. We often think of revolutions as swift, loud, and ideological. But sometimes, the most powerful revolutions happen in whispers, in the creak of a cart rolling away from a manor, in a coin pressed into a calloused palm, in a refusal to work for less than one is worth. The death of the manorial system was not a clean break. It lingered in language, in law, and in land tenure for centuries. But by the dawn of the 15th century, its heart had stopped beating. What rose in its place was not yet the modern world, but something in between. A world where lords became landlords, peasants became tenants, and power slowly shifted from custom to contract. And in this slow, unplanned revolution, we see one of history's great transitions. not just the end of feudalism, but the first stirrings of the state. But if the manor died and the peasant gained power, what of the kings? What of the state itself? What happens when centralized authority becomes more than protection, but control? And so we turn from the fields to the courts, from the plow to the pen, as we follow the birth of the nation-state and the costs that came with it. Story 2. Castles Crumble, the Longbow and the End of Chivalry. In the idealized vision of medieval Europe, the knight stood as a symbol of power and virtue. Encased in glistening mail or hardened plate, astride a warhorse bred for battle, he was the backbone of feudal warfare and the icon of noble pride. His loyalty was sworn to his lord, his skill forged in jousts and campaigns, his authority rooted in generations of aristocratic bloodlines. The knight was not merely a warrior, was a social institution. But institutions are fragile when they fail to adapt. The story of the knight's decline is not as sudden as a sword stroke, nor as dramatic as a siege. It is the story of how social changes, economic shifts, and military innovation, particularly the English longbow, dismantled centuries of chivalric supremacy. To understand this decline, we must first understand the role the knight once played. In the feudal world, the knight was the enforcer of land-based power. Lords granted land fiefs in exchange for military service. These knights, in turn, collected dues from peasants and defended their lords' interests, often violently. Their weapons were expensive, their armor custom-made, and their horses trained for specific battlefield maneuvers. Becoming a knight required wealth, training, and recognition. It was both a martial function and a caste. Warfare, too, was ceremonial in nature. The rules of engagement often honored rank. Prisoners were ransomed. Battles were sometimes avoided entirely in favor of skirmishes and sieges. Warfare was, in many respects, a game played by nobles against nobles, with peasants as both pawns and casualties. But then came the 100 Years' War conflict that would not only stretch for over a century, 1337–1453, but would fundamentally alter the nature of European warfare. At first, it seemed a nobles' war like any other. Kings disputing claims, knights rallying under banners, sieges, and alliances. Yet buried in the early years of this long war was an unassuming but lethal revolution: the English longbow. Simple in design, the longbow was a tall wooden bow, often over 6 feet in length, typically made from yew. It could shoot arrows over 200 yards and, crucially, could pierce armor at close range. Its arrows, often tipped with bodkin points, were designed to puncture chainmail and exploit the gaps in plate armor. But the weapon itself wasn't the true revolution. It was the archer. Unlike the knight, the longbowman was not of noble birth. He was a commoner, usually a yeoman farmer or townsman trained from youth to draw and release with deadly consistency. England's kings, recognizing the longbow's effectiveness, mandated regular archery practice among the population. Archery ranges were as common as churches in some areas. The longbowman represented something new: a professional, disciplined, and deadly soldier drawn from the lower classes. The first major demonstration of the longbow's potency came at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The French army, led by King Philip VI, outnumbered the English roughly 2-1. They brought with them heavily armored knights, crossbowmen from Genoa, and the confidence of tradition. They expected a rout. The English, led by King Edward III and his son Edward the Black Prince, positioned themselves on a hill, dug defensive pits, and planted wooden stakes. Behind this barrier stood rows of longbowmen. As the battle commenced, French crossbowmen advanced but were ineffective in the rain. English arrows flew fast, thick, and unrelenting. The French knights charged, only to be repelled again and again. Horses stumbled over the dead. Panic set in. Noble after noble fell, not in glorious duels, but skewered at a distance by arrows from men they never saw. It was a slaughter. Perhaps as many as 1,500 French nobles perished that day. Crécy shocked Europe not just for its outcome, but for what it symbolized: the death of knightly dominance on the battlefield. But Crécy was not an isolated incident. 10 years later, the Battle of Poitiers in 1356 delivered another devastating blow. Again, English archers decimated a numerically superior French army. The French king, John II, was captured at an unthinkable humiliation. The ransom demanded was colossal. Even the sanctity of royalty could no longer protect against common arrows. And then in 1415 came the most infamous demonstration of all: Agincourt. King Henry V of England, vastly outnumbered, led an exhausted army through French territory. Muddy, ill-fed, and trapped, his forces braced for annihilation. Instead, the French, again relying on their heavy cavalry, charged into narrow, muddy fields. The longbowmen, again protected by stakes, loosed tens of thousands of arrows. French knights bogged down in the mud. Horses fell. Chaos reigned. Over 6,000 French soldiers died, most of them nobles. The English lost fewer than 400. Agincourt did more than win a battle. It shattered the myth of chivalry. It proved that a peasant, with the right training and weapon, could kill a knight at distance. It revealed that brute force and armor could be undone by strategy, terrain, and discipline. But more than that, it undermined the social order. For centuries, the knight had justified his privileges through military service. Now, his utility was questioned. If commoners could do his job more effectively and at far less cost, what then was his role? This was more than a military problem. It was a social crisis. Knights resisted. They argued that battles like Agincourt were anomalies, that true warfare still required valor and rank. Some mocked archers as cowards. Others tried to outlaw certain types of arrows or insisted on renewed codes of conduct. But the world had changed. Armies became less aristocratic and more professional. Monarchs began to raise standing armies, paid with taxes, rather than relying solely on feudal levies. The distinction between knight and soldier blurred. Castles, the cornerstone of noble defense, were increasingly vulnerable to siege engines and gunpowder. Fortification design began to change, favoring lower walls and bastions over towering keeps. And the knight, once the master of the battlefield, became a ceremonial figure, still honored, still feared, but no longer indispensable. To understand the depth of this shift, consider how even chivalric literature began to change. The late medieval romances, once brimming with tales of duels and courtly love, grew more nostalgic, even melancholic. They mourned a world slipping away. Knighthood did not vanish overnight. It lingered in tournaments, in royal retinues, and in noble lineages. But it was no longer the engine of war. It was no longer the unquestioned master of society. It had been outclassed by an arrow. Yet even as the longbow rose to prominence, a question lingered. Was this truly a democratic turn in warfare? Or was one form of violence merely being replaced by another more efficient, more brutal, more impersonal? For while the longbow signaled the decline of the knight, it also marked the beginning of something else entirely. Something still forming in the shadows: the centralized, state-led army, loyal not to a lord but to a crown. After the blood-drenched fields of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, it was no longer possible to deny a changing reality. Military power was shifting away from individual valor and towards systemic efficiency. The knight, once the centerpiece of medieval warfare, was being outmaneuvered not just by peasants with bows, but by the very evolution of war itself. And at the center of this evolution stood castles, symbols of feudal authority, now increasingly vulnerable. It is here, amid stone walls and siege engines, that the decline of chivalry truly accelerated. The castle, a symbol of strength and its growing weakness. In the early Middle Ages, castles were not only military fortresses but administrative centers. A lord's castle projected dominance across the landscape. From its towers flew banners of noble lineage. Within its walls, justice was administered, food was stored, and people sheltered in times of crisis. But castles were expensive to build, maintain, and defend. Their defenses were once seen as near impregnable. A siege could take months, sometimes even years, depending on the supply lines and the terrain. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, siege technology outpaced tradition. Enter the counterweight trebuchet, perfected in the 13th century but increasingly used to devastating effect. This enormous engine could hurl massive stones at castle walls, breaking even thick masonry. Later came early cannon, primitive but powerful, particularly against high walls designed to repel arrows and scaling ladder-knot explosive impact. One by one, the once formidable fortresses of Europe began to fall. A particularly symbolic case was the fall of Château-Gaillard, built by Richard the Lionheart, which crumbled under siege in the early 14th century, well before cannon were even common. As siege techniques improved, castles were no longer safe havens. They were expensive targets. And with the castle's decline came a weakening of the localized power of the nobility. Nobles could no longer guarantee protection. Their ability to resist the crown or each other diminished. And with fewer strongholds, their reliance on the king's justice, army, and coin increased. Guard the rise of the infantry. As the knights' dominance waned, another transformation unfolded. Infantry soldiers, drawn largely from the lower classes, began to fill the battlefield. In England, longbowmen remained the backbone of the army. But on the continent, pikemen, crossbowmen, and later, handgunners started to emerge as vital components of war. Consider the Swiss pikemen. These mountain farmers developed a reputation for discipline, formation fighting, and ferocity. Their use of long pikes in tightly packed formations could stop cavalry charges dead in their tracks. They required no noble lineage, no heraldry training, courage, and cohesion. By the mid-15th century, mercenary companies were common, particularly in Italy and Germany. Known as condottieri, these professional soldiers fought for pay, not for fealty. They brought with them new tactics less reliant on personal bravery, more focused on maneuver, firepower, and numbers. This professionalization of warfare marked a significant departure from the chivalric code. In place of tournaments and rituals came logistics and planning. Wars were no longer contests between noble house, they were instruments of statecraft. Crowned kings over knights, the centralization of power. As feudal warfare declined, monarchs especially in England and France began to assert greater control over their realms. Warfare became centralized. Kings no longer summoned knights to fulfill their duties. They hired armies and paid them through taxes. This shift can be traced through administrative developments. England's exchequer began recording payments to archers, masons, and sailors. France's Estates General slowly gave way to direct royal taxation. In Burgundy, Charles the Bold assembled one of the most advanced standing armies in Europe, funded by trade and tightly managed accounts. These changes reflect a movement away from decentralized, personal fealty and toward bureaucratic, impersonal governance. And knights, many became redundant. Some adapted, becoming commanders, royal officials, or landowners detached from military life. Others fell into obscurity. Without warfare to justify their status, their position eroded. The idea of nobility through arms weakened. The battlefield no longer respected birth-it, rewarded organization. Scroll a changing ideology, chivalry as nostalgia. As knights declined in practice, chivalry flourished in literature. The gap between reality and romanticism widened. In the late 14th century, Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur emerged, a nostalgic retelling of King Arthur's court. It emphasized honor, loyalty, and noble quests, even as real knights were being replaced by mercenaries and gunmen. Chivalric orders persisted, like the Order of the Garter in England or the Order of the Golden Fleece in Burgundy, but they became more ceremonial, more about status than function. In many ways, chivalry became a form of denial. Nobles clung to the ideals of the past while the world marched forward. Tournaments continued, but they were theater. The battlefield no longer followed their script. Collision, gunpowder, and the final blow. If the longbow was the weapon that began the decline of chivalry, gunpowder was the one that made its return impossible. The first documented use of cannon in Europe dates to the early 14th century, but it was during the siege of Constantinople in 1453 that their power was fully realized. The Ottomans, using massive bombards, shattered the city's ancient walls that had stood for 1,000 years. In the West, smaller cannons became more common, mounted on carts and dragged into field battles. By the late 15th century, handheld firearms, primitive arquebuses, began to appear in large numbers. Armor, once a symbol of invincibility, became a liability. No breastplate could withstand a musket ball. Some knights began to discard their armor altogether, while others commissioned heavier, more elaborate suits that offered little mobility. The age of the mounted knight, charging across a field with lance lowered, was gone. In its place stood the modern soldier, disciplined, anonymous, deadly. Globe showing Europe, Africa, the political aftermath. With warfare increasingly controlled by centralized states, the balance of power shifted. Feudal levies were replaced by permanent military forces, under the crown's control. Fortifications changed design, favoring low, thick walls to resist cannon fire. Taxation became more systematic, funding wars directly from subjects rather than nobles. Local autonomy weakened as royal courts expanded their reach. This did not happen overnight. In rural France or the Scottish Highlands, feudal structures lingered. But in the halls of power, the language of control changed. No longer oaths and vassals, no decrees, revenues, and conscripts. The nobility was not erased, but it was repurposed. Knights became courtiers, landowners, and politicians. Power flowed less from the sword and more from the pen or the purse. And as castles crumbled and longbows sang their deadly chorus, a question began to take shape across Europe. If power no longer rests in the hands of lords and knights, then who exactly does it belong to? As the 15th century waned and the 16th emerged, a new European order took shape, an order shaped less by noble birth than by statecraft, coin, and centralized authority. The knight, once the armored embodiment of feudal power, now stood at the margins of relevance, a fading silhouette against the backdrop of cannon smoke and parchment treaties. But the final stage in the decline of knighthood is not merely military. It is social, political, psychological. It is about how a once dominant class copes with obsolescence and how the systems that upheld it reshape themselves around new priorities. Let us examine the elements of that transformation. The knight's identity crisis. For centuries, a knight's identity had been inseparable from war. He earned his title by combat and maintained his status through feudal service. But by the 1400s, the rituals of knighthood, dubbing ceremonies, jousts, and tournaments had begun to feel theatrical. The last large-scale feudal levies of knights in England and France were replaced by paid soldiers and conscripts. While noble-born men still led armies, their rank no longer guaranteed their presence on the battlefield. Increasingly, command was a matter of training and administrative skill, not just lineage. Even the social contract had shifted. In the late medieval period, nobles had been expected to defend their dependents in exchange for rents, dues, and loyalty. Now, defense came from the crown's army, not a local lord's retainers. The monarch, not the baron, became the guarantor of safety. What then was a knight? Some tried to cling to old roles, defending tradition in court and in literature. Others transformed, becoming landowners, administrators, or courtiers, adapting to a world of politics rather than war. Still others found themselves idle, their martial training irrelevant, their titles hollow. With no wars to fight and no clear place in the new order, some knights turned to private violence feuds, banditry, or mercenary work. It is no coincidence that the late 15th century saw the rise of robber knights in German nobles who, deprived of meaningful income or purpose, took to plundering merchant caravans and rival estates. These were not brigands in the traditional sense. They were aristocrats refusing to concede their decline. But history does not negotiate with nostalgia. Book's chivalry rewritten, the fantasy of the past. Even as the knight's practical role disappeared, chivalry underwent a revival in literature but as myth, not manual. Writers like Sir Thomas Malory, Christine de Pizan, and later Erasmus and Castiglione described idealized versions of knighthood. Their knights were paragons of virtue, restraint, loyalty, and justice. They fought not for land but for honor. They loved chastely, ruled wisely, and died nobly. But this chivalry bore little resemblance to the brutal realities of 14th century warfare. The massacres at Limoges, the murder of prisoners at Agincourt, and the mercenary sacking of cities stood in stark contrast to the imagined world of Arthur's Round Table. Indeed, this disconnect was part of the appeal. Chivalric romance offered comfort, a dream of order in a chaotic, changing world. By the early 1500s, knights appeared more in masks and pageants than on campaigns. They were honored in title, paraded in ceremonies, but rarely consulted for serious affairs of state. The sword had become symbolic. The real power lay elsewhere. Money bag, money over might. The economics of obsolescence. Perhaps nothing sealed the knight's fate more firmly than money. The knightly class had long depended on land-based wealth, rents collected from peasants who farmed manorial estates. But as cities grew, trade expanded, and banking flourished, urban merchants and financiers began to rival and surpass traditional nobles in economic power. A merchant in Venice or Bruges could outspend a baron. A banker in Florence could finance a war. Power was no longer solely tied to land, it was tied to capital, liquidity, and credit. This economic shift had practical consequences. Castles, once defensive hubs, were too costly to maintain. Armor, especially full plate, became too expensive and strategically obsolete. Raising armies required cash, not loyalty. Even the knighthood became purchasable in some places. In early modern France, for example, the sale of offices and titles became commonplace. Nobility could be bought. Chivalry became less a matter of valor, more a matter of revenue. Classical, the rise of the state, bureaucracy, and the king's army. While knights struggled to find relevance, kings and queens built the foundations of modern states. They centralized power, standardized laws, and created professional militaries. In France, the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, a standing cavalry force created in the 1440s, marked the beginning of a permanent royal army. In England, the Tudor monarchy emphasized administrative control over military reliance on the nobility. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella centralized power by reducing the independence of the grandees. These monarchs employed lawyers, scribes, tax collectors, and engineers, none of whom owed their positions to knighthood. The military revolution of the 16th century, with its emphasis on infantry, artillery, and fortification, required skills a feudal warrior was never trained for. The knight's battlefield had moved to the bureaucratic chamber, and he was unequipped for it. Compass, a global perspective, the knight abroad. Interestingly, the decline of the knight in Europe mirrored similar transitions elsewhere. In Japan, for example, the samurai, like European knights, had been the warrior elite of a feudal society. But by the 17th century, during the Tokugawa shogunate, they became bureaucrats and retainers. The sword remained, but the battlefield had vanished. Both the knight and the samurai were absorbed into the machinery of centralized rule-respected relics of a more violent past. In the Islamic world, Mamluks and Ghulems, warrior slaves who once held great power, also lost relevance with the rise of gunpowder empires and centralized states like the Ottomans. War across civilizations was changing. It was no longer personal, ritualistic, or seasonal. It was systemic, brutal, and constant. Checkered flag, the final tournament. The 16th century witnessed the final, ceremonial flourishes of knighthood. Tournaments were still held at courts, especially in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Orders of chivalry, such as the Order of the Garter, Order of the Golden Fleece, and Order of St. Michael, continued to induct members. Armor became more ornate, gilded, etched, and impractical. It was no longer meant for war, but for display. The knight lived on, but in pageantry, not power. Ironically, one of the clearest acknowledgments of knighthood's obsolescence came in literature itself. In 1605, Miguel de Cervantes published Don Quixote, a satire about an aging nobleman who, addled by tales of chivalry, dons armor, mounts an old horse, and sets out to revive a world that no longer exists. He fights windmills, mistakes peasants for princesses, and interprets every mundane occurrence as part of a grand knightly quest. Don Quixote is not a hero. He is a relic noble in intent, absurd in practice. Cervantes had captured the truth of the knight's fall, not with anger or resentment, but with melancholy. The age of chivalry had become an echo. End arrow. Final reflections, when might yields to system. So what then do we make of this long, slow unraveling? The fall of the knight is not just the story of a class losing its grip on power. It is the story of how systems evolve, how military, economic, and political realities reshape the very definitions of honor, loyalty, and identity. The longbow killed the knight's dominance on the battlefield. Gunpowder made his armor obsolete. Bureaucracy made his local power irrelevant. Commerce made his economic base unstable. And literature finally transformed him into a symbol rather than a force. Yet the knight remains in our collective memory, noble, proud, and doomed. A reminder that even the mightiest can fad not through revolution, or conquest but through irrelevance. And so we leave behind the castle keep, the glint of polished armor, and the banner fluttering in a vanished breeze. Ahead lies a different battlefield, one of taxes, courts, and proclamations. The knight dismounts and the state takes the reins. But as power becomes more centralized, a new question emerges. What happens when the state becomes more powerful than any single lord or knight ever was? Story 3. The Wool Tax and the Crown, England's Rise Through Commerce. It begins not with a king or a battle, but with a sheep. In the quiet green hills of medieval England, hundreds of thousands of sheep grazed. They were tended by peasants, monks, and landowners alike. These animals were not just sources of food or clothing, they were, quite literally, the economic backbone of the English crown. Their fleece clothed a continent. Their wool filled the coffers of kings. To understand how England evolved from a feudal patchwork into a centralized monarchy with an international footprint, you must first understand wool. By the 13th century, English wool was considered the finest in Europe, particularly the long-stapled, high lanolin fleece from the Cotswolds and Welsh marches. European textile centers, especially Flanders and northern Italy, mended it to produce high-quality cloth. The English, for the most part, did not weave it themselves. They exported raw wool in vast quantities to buyers across the Channel. But more than just trade, wool was power. And that power transformed England's government, its social structure, and its relationship to Europe. The medieval wool economy. The English wool trade was already flourishing by the 1200s, but it reached new heights in the 14th century. Wool became England's most valuable export, with millions of fleeces shipped out annually. Merchants traveled from London to Bruges, from York to Calais, carrying bales across roads and rivers. The trade was carefully regulated. The staple system, formalized in 1326, required all wool exports to pass through designated ports called staple towns where customs duties could be collected. Chief among these was Calais, captured from the French during the Hundred Years' War and held by the English for over 2 centuries. It became England's economic gateway to the continent. Wool merchants flocked there, guarded by royal officials and garrison troops. Every sack of wool was taxed, every transaction noted. Wool paid for castles, wool paid for campaigns. Wool more than gold financed the English crown. Crown royal revenue, the crown and the cloth. Medieval monarchs rarely had consistent sources of income. Unlike today's governments, they could not levy income tax or control central banks. Instead, kings relied on customs duties, feudal dues, rents from royal lands, and, when desperate, forced loans or parliamentary subsidies. But wool offered something more stable: export tax revenue. Starting in the 1270s, the English crown imposed a duty on every exported sack of wool. It was a steady stream of income that required no baronial approval. Over time, this tax grew heavier and more structured. By the reign of Edward III in the mid-14th century, wool duties accounted for more than half of the royal revenue. Edward, in particular, saw the wool trade as a political tool. Facing constant wars with France and Scotland, he needed funds quickly and reliably. So he courted the merchant classes, offering them privileges in exchange for loans and political loyalty. In 1337, he created the Company of the Staple, a powerful merchant guild that received exclusive rights to export wool through Calais. In return, the company agreed to advance loans to the crown, effectively serving as the king's bank. This was a crucial shift. For the first time, the monarchy's survival was tied not to the feudal nobility, but to a class of urban merchants. Receipt feudalism undone by finance. This new economic relationship had broader implications. Feudalism, as a system, relied on land-based power. Nobles controlled manors, collected rents, and provided knights in exchange for royal favor. But when the king could raise funds through taxes on trade and borrow from merchants, power of the nobility began to erode. Edward III and his successors bypassed baronial councils, leaning instead on the growing economic power of cities and guilds. In exchange, towns received charters, privileges, and royal protection. The House of Commons, composed largely of knights and burgesses, began to assert greater influence in Parliament. Why? Because they controlled the purse. This dynamic culminated in moments like the Good Parliament of 1376, where the Commons demanded royal accountability in exchange for financial support. It was the beginning of representative bargaining, a feature that would define English constitutional development for centuries. Wool was not merely a commodity, it was a lever that shifted the balance between king, noble, and commoner. Yarn the monks and the merchants. It wasn't just kings who profited from wool. Monasteries, particularly the great Cistercian and Benedictine abbeys, became some of the largest sheep farmers in England. Their lands sprawled across the countryside, and their flocks numbered in the thousands. The monks developed efficient systems of grazing, shearing, and baling. Income from wool allowed monasteries to build stone churches, fund manuscript production, and maintain elaborate hospitality networks for travelers and pilgrims. But it also made them deeply entangled in commerce. By the 14th century, some monasteries were effectively agribusinesses, hiring lay managers, investing in infrastructure, and competing with secular landlords. Meanwhile, urban merchants, some of them former peasants or second sons of minor nobility, rose to prominence. These wool traders financed ships, negotiated with European buyers, and gained influence at court. In towns like Winchester, Coventry, and Norwich, fortunes were built not on sword or seal but on fleece. Globe showing Europe, Africa, England, and the European marketplace. Wool connected England to the wider world. Its primary destination was Flanders, where cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres were home to bustling cloth industries. Flemish weavers turned English wool into fine textiles, which were then traded across Europe and the Mediterranean. This created a strange dependency. England supplied the raw material, but relied on foreigners for the finished product. At various times, this dependency created political tension. In 1336, when Flemish cities wavered in their support during the Hundred Years' War, Edward III issued an extraordinary invitation. He encouraged Flemish weavers to migrate to England. Many accepted. Settling in towns like Colchester and York, they brought advanced weaving techniques with them. This marked the nascent beginnings of an English cloth industry development that, in time, would further disrupt feudal economics. Chart decreasing consequences of collapse when wool failed. Of course, no boom is eternal. Periods of overproduction, trade embargoes, and war disrupted the wool economy. When Calais was lost in 1558, it severed England's direct link to the continent. At times, bad harvests or sheep diseases caused prices to plummet. The market was vulnerable. Moreover, as the domestic cloth industry expanded in the late 15th and 16th centuries, raw wool exports declined. This shifted the economic structure, again less reliant on customs duties, more on internal production and consumption. Still, the centuries of wool dominance left a deep mark. By the Tudor period, enclosure movements, fencing off of common land for sheep grazing, were transforming the countryside. Peasants were displaced, leading to rural poverty and waves of migration to cities. Some historians argue that wool laid the groundwork for England's early capitalist economy, a system rooted not in birthright, but in profit. End arrow. Final thoughts: how sheep strengthened sovereignty. When we speak of nation-states, we often look for political milestones: treaties signed, crowns united, laws enacted. But sometimes, the seeds of sovereignty are sown in markets, not monarchies. Wool helped transform England from a feudal kingdom into a mercantile state. It funded war, empowered the commons, weakened the barons, and knit the countryside into an international economy. Its legacy is not romantic. There are no battles won by sheep, no epics sung of fleece. Yet in the quiet arithmetic of customs ledgers and the soft rustling of wool bales, a new kind of power was forming, gone based on trade, administration, and taxation. A power less visible, but no less real. The English crown, once dependent on oaths and homage, became dependent on commerce. And in that dependency lay the seeds of a new state on where economic strategy would often dictate political survival. But if wool taught the crown how to govern through revenue, it also introduced a new danger. What happens when the crown becomes too dependent on economic forces it cannot control? As the 14th century advanced, England's rulers found themselves balancing an increasingly complex equation: warfare, wool, and parliament. What had begun as a simple export duty on fleece evolved into a profound restructuring of power where economic necessity reshaped political authority. In this section, we leave behind the fields and sheepfolds and step into the echoing halls of medieval parliament, where wool bales stood stacked near the speaker's chair, not just as merchandise, but as metaphors for the growing entanglement of wealth and governance. The rise of the commons. To understand how wool influenced politics, we must first consider the changing nature of parliament. In the early 13th century, England's National Assembly was still in its infancy, dominated by nobles and clergy, summoned at the king's pleasure. But over time, the House of Commons, comprising knights of the shire and burgesses, urban representatives, began to play a more vital role, especially as taxation increased. The 1295 model Parliament of Edward I established the pattern. The king would summon representatives to approve new taxes, particularly when preparing for war. These representatives, many from wool-producing regions, found their voice not through swords, but through sacks of fleece. Why? Because the monarchy's growing reliance on wool taxation and trade meant that merchants and landowners had leverage. If the king needed funds, he had to listen. By the mid-14th century, the commons were not only approving taxes, they were demanding conditions. They began requesting audits of royal spending, the removal of corrupt officials, and even changes in policy. Wool, quite literally, bought political influence. Moneybag Edward III and the politics of profit. King Edward III reigned 1327–1377, offers perhaps the clearest example of how economic entanglement shifted political dynamics. Edward was a warrior king, ambitious and expensive. His campaigns in France and Scotland as part of the 100 Years' War required a steady influx of money. While the nobility provided troops, the merchant class provided liquidity. The wool subsidia, tax per exported sack, became a cornerstone of royal finance. But in 1337, Edward went further. He granted monopoly rights to a group of merchants known as the Merchants of the Staple. In exchange for exclusive control over wool exports, these merchants provided loans to fund military expeditions. This was more than economic policy. It was a partnership between the crown and commerce. However, it came at a cost. The monopolies angered smaller traders and producers, and Parliament began to push back. By 1340, following military failures and financial chaos, Edward faced significant pressure. Parliament demanded greater oversight and even refused taxation until previous loans were accounted for. This tug-of-war crown commons, commerce would repeat throughout the century. And wool was always at the center. The good Parliament and the crisis of credibility. By 1376, the tension reached a turning point. The Good Parliament, so called by chroniclers for its attempt at reform, was convened during the final years of Edward III's reign. England was weary, military gains in France were revering, corruption was rife, and the wool trade had slowed. The Commons, emboldened by decades of financial bargaining, refused new taxes unless conditions were met. They called for the removal of royal advisors, demanded reforms in the exchequer, and insisted on the prosecution of officials who had mismanaged funds. They even appointed Peter de la Mare, a merchant-class MP, as Speaker of the House of Commons, a symbolic assertion that commerce had earned a seat at the highest table. Though the reforms were soon reversed by the heir, John of Gaunt, the precedent had been set. That Parliament could be more than a rubber stamp. That wealth not just lineage commanded political power. That the wool economy had become inseparable from governance. Yarn a new kind of landowner. Wool's political influence was not confined to London or Parliament. Across the countryside, a new social class was emerging, the gentry. These were not great nobles or humble peasants. They were landowners of middling status, often knights, wealthy farmers, or clerics who turned to sheep farming as a source of income. Compared to crop farming, wool required fewer workers, was less vulnerable to bad harvests, and offered steady returns. Many gentry enclosed land, consolidated holdings, and leased grazing rights. Over time, these wool-rich landowners gained local influence. They served as justices of the peace, collected taxes, and represented counties in Parliament. They often had ties to merchant guilds and city financiers, Some even married into the lesser nobility. The gentry blurred the line between rural tradition and urban wealth, between feudal heritage and capitalist ambition. And their interests increasingly aligned with royal authority, not baronial independence. Nobles in decline. As wool filled the purses of gentry and merchants, many traditional nobles found themselves in decline. Accustomed to wealth through land rents and feudal dues, they struggled to compete in a marketplace increasingly driven by commerce. Some tried to adapt, investing in sheep, leasing land, or engaging in trade. Others fell into debt. The royal court, once dominated by great earls and dukes, now made room for new men, merchants, financiers, and administrators whose talents lay in numbers, not names. This economic transformation weakened baronial independence. Without the financial means to raise armies or maintain retinues, nobles became increasingly dependent on the crown's favor. In short, the monarchy gained power not through force but through fleece. Globe showing Europe, Africa, wool, and foreign policy. Wool did not only shape internal politics, it influenced foreign diplomacy. Flemish cities, reliant on English wool, were key strategic partners in the 100 Years' War. Edward III's alliances with Bruges and Ghent were secured not through dynastic marriages, but through trade promises. At times, embargoes were used as weapons. When political alliances faltered, England could cut off the wool supply, threatening economic collapse in cloth-producing regions. Conversely, when English wool was in high demand, foreign princes courted England for trade access. Thus, wool became a tool of statecraft, just as valuable as treaties or armies. Chart decreasing risks and repercussions. But dependence on a single export is always risky. The wool trade faced numerous disruptions. The Black Death, 1340–1351, reduced population and labor, affecting both supply and demand. War and piracy threatened trade routes. Continental production of raw wool increased, reducing English dominance. Shifting tastes and fashion trends lowered demand for heavy woolen cloths. These challenges forced the crown to diversify its sources of revenue and laid the groundwork for domestic cloth production, a trend that would dominate in the 15th and 16th centuries. Still, the political structures built during the wool boom endured. Parliament, empowered by centuries of financial bargaining, was not easily dismissed. The Commons had tasted influence and would not forget it. End arrow. Final thoughts. Commerce as constitution. In the end, wool did more than warm bodies or line purses. It reshaped the very foundations of English governance. It funded monarchs who no longer needed feudal armies. It empowered Parliament to become a check on royal power. It elevated the gentry and merchant classes, weakening the traditional nobility. It connected domestic policy to international trade, forever tying England to the fortunes of the global economy. In the long arc of state formation, wool was not a side character, it was a central actor. And yet, its success carried a question that would haunt the future. If a crown can be built on commerce, can it also be undone by it? By the close of the 15th century, the English wool trade had done more than enrich merchants and fill royal coffers. It had reconfigured the very nature of power. What had once been a rural economy governed by feudal lords had, through the quiet weight of commerce, evolved into a proto-capitalist monarchy with national ambitions. But this final section is not a triumphalist tale of economic progress. It is a sobering account of what happens when economic centralization births political centralization, when the kingdom becomes the crown, and the crown becomes a machine. Wool may have begun as a trade commodity. By the dawn of the Tudor Age, it had become a foundation of statecraft. Infrastructure, surveillance, and the crown's reach. Commerce requires structure, and with the wool trade came an explosion of infrastructure, much of it overseen or influenced by the crown. Roads were improved not for peasant comfort, but for merchants and tax officials. Bridges and river crossings were repaired to facilitate wool transport to staple ports. Weighing stations, toll booths, and customs houses dotted the trade routes, ensuring that goods were taxed and accounted for. Each of these installations brought royal officials into closer contact with local communities. The man with the badge of the exchequer became, as Feridan sometimes more softened, the local lord. Taxation required record-keeping, and record-keeping required bureaucracy. The wool trade gave rise to an early form of surveillance state not in the modern sense, but through ledgers, rolls, and inspectors. The crown tracked exports, monitored merchants, and punished smugglers with increasing sophistication. This was not merely about money, it was about control. The merchant-crown nexus. As the wool trade evolved, the relationship between merchants and the monarchy deepened into something more enduring and more precarious. Royal borrowing became routine. Kings took loans from merchant syndicates, repaid through customs duties. This effectively pledged future revenues to private lenders. At times when war or debt defaulted, tensions flared. One notable example, the Riccardi of Lucca, a powerful Italian banking family, lent heavily to Edward I in the late 13th century. When war disrupted repayment, Edward confiscated their assets and left them ruined. A century later, similar fates would befall Flemish and English financiers. But most merchants saw the risks as worth the reward. Royal favor brought monopolies, charters, and exemptions. Many merchant families entered Parliament, acquired titles, and became part of the ruling elite. The line between commercial class and ruling class blurred. Thread domestic cloth, shifting the economic engine. By the late 15th century, something new was happening. England was no longer just exporting wool, it was weaving it. Spurred by the importation of Flemish techniques and the migration of skilled weavers, towns like Leeds, Halifax, and Kendal began producing cloth at scale. Unlike wool, cloth could be taxed at multiple stages: production, transport, sale, and export. This delighted the crown. As cloth overtook wool in importance, the domestic economy diversified, giving rise to proto-industrial towns. These centers often operated outside traditional manorial structures. They were governed by guilds, corporations, and royal charters, not local nobles. With them came a new political geography: urban, taxable, loyal to the monarch. Locked enclosure, the dark side of growth. While merchants and the crown profited, many peasants did not. The expansion of sheep farming driven by wool prices and later cloth production to enclosure. The fencing off of open fields and commons previously used for grazing or subsistence farming. Landowners, including monasteries and members of the gentry, increasingly converted arable land to pasture for sheep. Fewer laborers were needed, rents were raised, and common rights were revoked. Entire villages were depopulated, families displaced. Some moved to towns. Others became vagrants, punished by harsh poor laws passed to control the fallout. The economic logic was unassailable. A single shepherd could manage as much land as several farming families. Wool, unlike grain, could be stored and transported easily, but the social cost was enormous. This was perhaps the first English example of economic efficiency, outweighing communal stability. The Tudor synthesis, crown as corporation. By the time the Tudors rose to power in 1485, the English monarchy was no longer merely feudal, it was corporate in nature. Henry VII, a cautious and calculating king, leveraged the wool and cloth economy to build a stable financial base. He supported the merchant adventurers, encouraged domestic production, and restructured royal finances to reduce dependence on Parliament. His son, Henry VII, took the model further. When in need of cash, he dissolved monasteries, many of which were rich in sheep land, and sold the estates to gentry and courtiers. This redistribution of land created a new loyal landowning class, enriched by wool, indebted to the crown. More importantly, it ensured that economic interests and royal power were aligned. The monarchy no longer ruled despite the economy, it was the economy. Balanced law and standardization. With economic power came legal centralization. The wool trade required uniform weights, measures, contracts, and courts. This led to the standardization of English law, an essential step in the development of a nation-state. The Court of the Staple, for example, had jurisdiction over trade disputes. The Exchequer became a permanent institution, staffed by clerks who processed thousands of financial transactions annually. The Statute of Merchants and Statute of the Staple provided legal recourse for creditors, unusual protections for the time. This legal infrastructure gave merchants confidence and gave the state reach. Compass the global future, from wool to empire. Though this story centers on medieval England, its consequences stretch outward. Wool-funded state structures laid the groundwork for future expansion. The administrative expertise, financial mechanisms, and merchant networks honed through the wool trade would later support colonial enterprises, naval logistics, and imperial bureaucracy. In a very real sense, the ships that sailed to the New World, India, and Africa were built in a kingdom shaped by sheep. End arrow. Final reflections, the fleece and the future. The decline of feudalism was not marked by revolutions or manifestos. It was not shouted from castles or etched into stone. It whispered through the tally books of merchants, the contracts of wool traders, and the ledgers of royal accountants. It flowed through rivers bearing bales to Calais. It flickered in the candle-lit chambers of Parliament. It rustled in the fields as shepherds moved their flocks over enclosed hills. Wool changed England not through idealism, but through the patient accumulation of capital, record-keeping, and state interest. From fleece to fortress, from bale to bureaucracy, the story of wool is the story of how economic necessity quietly remade political reality. And yet, as power concentrated and the state solidified, one question remained unresolved. If commerce built the state, could commerce one day unravel it? Story 4, Jacquerie and Justice, the Peasant Uprising of 1358. It began with rumors, whispers of castles in flames, of nobles on the run, of peasants in arms. In the summer of 1358, northern France, already ravaged by war, plague, and taxation, became the stage for one of the most ferocious rural revolts of the medieval era, the Jacquerie. It was a rebellion born not in ideology, but in desperation. A spontaneous combustion of anger from those who had tilled the soil, fed the kingdom, and buried their dead without ever receiving justice or relief. But to truly understand the Jacquerie, we must first walk the broken roads of France in the mid-14th century, where nobility had failed, war had consumed, and the people were left not just impoverished, but enraged. The fractured kingdom. By the 1350s, France was a kingdom in crisis. The 100 Years' War between England and France had been raging for 2 decades. Edward III's armies had repeatedly invaded northern France, pillaging towns and laying waste to farmland. In 1356, the unthinkable happened. At the Battle of Poitiers, the French King John II was captured by the English. France was left without its monarch. His son, Dauphin Charles, later Charles V, served as regent, but his authority was uncertain, contested by both nobles and Parisian factions. The nobility, meanwhile, had suffered devastating losses at Poitiers. Many prominent knights had been killed, captured, or bankrupted by the cost of ransom. This created a power vacuum into which chaos poured. Pig life in the countryside. For the peasantry known broadly as villeins life had always been difficult, but by 1358 it had become unbearable. English and French armies had both ravaged rural regions. Fields lay fallow, villages were abandoned, and livestock slaughtered or stolen. The Black Death, 1340–1351, had wiped out a third or more of the population, leaving labor scarce and communities fragile. Taxes were crushing, imposed to fund military campaigns and to raise ransom for the captured king. But what made it worse was that no one protected them. With the nobility absent or hiding behind city walls, bands of mercenaries known as routiers roamed the countryside. Nominally soldiers, they became marauders, plundering, raping, and burning with impunity. Lords failed to defend their lands. Local officials offered no security. The peasants were left alone, exposed and exploited. And then, one day, they decided they had had enough. Fire the spark. The exact spark of the Jacquerie is unclear. It likely began in the Oise Valley, near the village of Saint-Loup-Desserent, in late May 1358. A group of peasants attacked a local noble's manor, burned it, and killed its inhabitants. The violence spread with astonishing speed. Within days, castles across the Ile-de-France, Picardy, and Champagne were under siege or in ruins. Peasants formed armed bands, sometimes numbering in the thousands, carrying axes, clubs, and farm tools. They attacked manor houses, sacked noble estates, and executed aristocrats. One chronicler, Jean the Belle, wrote, "They killed without pity all knights and squires they found, violated their ladies and daughters, and destroyed all that could be destroyed." The name Jacquerie comes from the derogatory nickname Jacques Bonhomme, a term nobles used for the average peasant, suggesting ignorance and simplicity. But the rebellion showed nothing of the sort. The Jacquerie was organized, intentional, and targeted. This was not random savagery. It was a political statement, however crude, that the nobility had failed in their duty to protect and govern. In their absence, the peasants would hold them accountable. The nobles retreat. The French nobility was stunned. They had seen peasant unrest before, sporadic tax protests, food riots, but never an armed rural uprising, and never with such rage. Entire families of nobles were hunted down, their bodies mutilated, their estates razed. Lords who had once ridden proudly through the countryside now fled to walled cities or into hiding. Some attempted to raise small forces to retaliate, but were overwhelmed. In several towns, local authorities negotiated with rebels either out of sympathy or fear. In Paris, Etienne Marcel, the influential leader of the merchant class, viewed the Jacquerie with strategic interest. He too opposed the high nobility and sought to reform the monarchy. Though Marcel did not formally ally with the rebels, he allowed some to enter Paris and sheltered their leaders. This momentum radicals and rural rebels coexisting was brief, but it terrified the nobility. For in that alliance lay the potential for a full social revolution. Balance the demands behind the violence. The rebels never issued a formal manifesto, but their actions made their motives clear. They targeted the symbols and structures of noble privilege: manor houses, coats of arms, feudal records. They spared churches, indicating their anger was not directed at religion. They welcomed urban artisans and minor officials, showing a cross-class solidarity. They demanded, where they could, the abolition of noble rights and relief from taxation. The revolt was fueled not only by misery, but by a sense of betrayal. The peasantry had endured the plague, the war, and the taxes, and now, as the noble class crumbled, it seemed the moment to settle accounts. But violence, no matter how cathartic, invites retaliation. And soon the hammer fell. Crossed the response. In June 1358, the nobility regrouped. A knight named Charles of Navarre, allied with royalist forces, began organizing counterattacks. Armed bands of mounted men-at-arms descended on peasant strongholds. Their goal was not merely suppression, it was retribution. One by one, rebel groups were hunted down. Entire villages were burned. Rebels were tortured, hanged, or beheaded in the dozens. The nobility made public exempless executions held in marketplaces, with body parts displayed at roadsides. The decisive moment came at Meaux, where a large group of rebel peasants had gathered. There, they were confronted by a force led by the Count of Foix and the Captal de Butch. The noblemen slaughtered the rebels in a brutal chargement, women and children alike. By late June, the Jacquerie was effectively crushed. Thousands were dead. Hundreds of villages had been depopulated. A warning had been issued. The message: there would be no peasant revolution. Not yet. Jigsaw unanswered questions. The Jacquerie ended as suddenly as it began, but it left behind a silence that was not peace. The nobility had reasserted control, but only barely. The monarchy was still in disarray. The urban bourgeoisie remained restless, and the countryside was more embittered than ever. Historians continue to debate the Jacquerie's nature. Was it a true class uprising or a localized breakdown? Did it have organized leadership, or was it spontaneous? Was it merely a cry of rage, or the birth pangs of modern resistance? What is clear is that the Jacquerie terrified the ruling classes. Its memory echoed for centuries, cited in court records, sermons, and chronicles, as a warning of what happened when the lower orders believed they had the right to rise. Yet even in its failure, the Jacquerie revealed a deeper truth: that feudalism was not eternal, that the bonds of custom and duty could break, that the peasants, long presumed passive, had limits. And when those limits were crossed, when the lords vanished, and the fields were left to burn, the quietest voices could become the loudest thunder. In the immediate aftermath of the Jacquerie's brutal suppression, the countryside fell into silence. It was not a peaceful quiet, but one of trauma, hush imposed by gallows, torches, and broken doors. The rebellion had failed. Its leaders were dead. Entire villages had been punished. And yet, in the minds of both the ruling elite and the common folk, the memory of that uprising would linger for generations, a ghost at every manor door, a whisper in the courts of kings, a smudge on the illusion of feudal permanence. The years that followed were defined by fear on all sides: fear of rebellion, fear of revenge, fear of change. Let us now explore the repression that followed, how the elite tried to ensure the Jacquerie would never be repeated, and how, in doing so, they revealed just how fragile their world had become. The machinery of repression. After the revolt, the nobility responded with ferocity, but also with policy. The punitive violence, hangings, floggings, mutilations, was swift and theatrical. These were not mere acts of vengeance. They were deliberate tools of psychological warfare. The message was clear: rebellion would be met not with negotiation, but with annihilation. Yet physical suppression was only part of the strategy. The elite also turned to law, record, and symbolism to restore order. Royal decrees were issued outlawing the formation of peasant bands and criminalizing assembly, without noble oversight. Village leaders suspected of involvement in passively were replaced with more loyal, often urban-connected figures. Feudal obligations were reaffirmed in legal contracts. Lords reasserted their rights to labor, tithes, and judgment, even in cases where such rights had become practically obsolete. In essence, the state sought to rewrite the social contract, not through new ideas, but through old rules spoken louder and with sharper edges. Books, the chroniclers, and the narrative of blame. What people remember often depends on what gets written. The story of the Jacquerie, as it has come down to us, is shaped by elite chroniclers, men like Jean Froissart, Jean Lebel, and the anonymous authors of court records. These were literate men tied to the aristocracy and clergy. Their pens were weapons of control. They portrayed the rebels as mindless brutes, stirred to violence by envy and ignorance. In their words, the peasants were beasts without reason. drunken on false ideas, ungrateful to their betters, guilty of unnatural acts. Such language was not neutral, it was propaganda. It served to dehumanize the rebels and reassure nobles and townsmen alike that the social order was still righteous, still moral, still divinely ordained. Interestingly, these same chroniclers acknowledged the failures of the nobility, though often with a gentle hand. Some wrote of the neglect of protection or the overburden of taxation, suggesting that while the rebellion was unjustified, its causes were not entirely imaginary. But even these admissions were cloaked in paternalism. The message was, "We have erred, but they must never rise." The political ramifications. At the time of the Jacquerie, France was a kingdom without a king. John II remained a prisoner of the English, and the regency of Dauphin Charles was tenuous. His authority was challenged not just by peasants, but by nobles, merchants, and external enemies. In this context, repressing the Jacquerie was politically vital. Charles had to reassert control not just over territory, but over meaning. He needed to show that only the monarchy could restore order. So in the months following the revolt, Charles made strategic moves. He aligned with the nobility, promising stronger protections and legal clarity for feudal rights. He cracked down on urban dissent, executing Etienne Marcel and dismantling the reformist movement in Paris. He promoted the idea of a monarchy that stood above class conflict, that preserved hierarchy but promised peace. In doing so, Charles began to forge what would become the centralizing French statia monarchy that used bureaucracy, law, and image to bind its fractious kingdom. The Jacquerie, though defeated, had served as a turning point. It made clear that order could not rely on custom alone. It required structure, surveillance, and force. Thread the peasants' wounds. For the peasants who survived the Jacquerie, life returned to a bitter normal. Their grievances remained. Taxation persisted. War continued. Mercenaries still roamed. Lords still claimed rights they had long ceased to fulfill. But they also learned. They learned that spontaneous violence without coordination or protection was suicidal. Future peasant movements would look different, less overt, more organized, often led by figures with some legal or religious education. In many places, peasants returned to the tools of passive resistance: withholding labor, hiding goods during tax collection, filing appeals in royal courts, fleeing to cities where feudal obligations could be evaded. In this way, the energy of revolt shifted underground. The Jacquerie had failed as an insurrection, but it succeeded in changing the psychology of rural France. The illusion of the peasant as passive and content had been shattered. Crossed echoes across Europe. The Jacquerie was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader wave of social unrest that swept across Europe in the 14th century. In England, the peasants' revolt of 1381 would see Wat Tyler and his followers march on London, demanding an end to serfdom and regressive taxes. In Flanders, guild uprisings challenged both merchant elites and noble landlords. In the German-speaking lands, the Buncha and later the German peasants, war of the 16th century would echo similar demands. Each of these revolts was crushed, yet each left a dent in the armor of feudalism. The Jacquerie was the first raw, violent, uncoordinated, but unforgettable. Scroll myth, memory, and moral. For centuries after 1358, the term Jacquerie would be used by elites as a warning, and by radicals as a rallying cry. To nobles, it meant chaos, the collapse of God's order, the inversion of society, the murder of innocents. To commoners, it meant resistance, the moment when the humble refused to bow. During the French Revolution in 1789, pamphlets circulated calling for a new Jacquerie, a reminder that the memory of 1358 had never truly died. Even in the modern French language, une jacquerie refers to a spontaneous, violent popular uprising. Its historical roots are invoked with both fear and awe. That the revolt has endured in language is testament to its symbolic power. It was not the largest or the most successful peasant rebellion, but it was the one that forced the ruling class to see the abyss and to spend centuries trying to build a wall against it. End arrow final reflections, the legacy of the uprising. So what did the Jacquerie leave behind? No new laws, no dismantling of feudalism, no redistribution of land. And yet it changed everything. It exposed the cracks in the feudal order. It forced monarchs to centralize. It made nobles wary. It taught peasants that silence was not inevitable. Perhaps most importantly, it revealed that violence is sometimes not about victory, but about visibility. The rebels of 1358 knew they would likely lose, but for a brief, burning season, they turned the world upside down, and in that inversion, they made themselves seen. In history, we often remember kings and treaties, but the Jacquerie reminds us of something else, that even the voiceless can speak, and when they do, the whole kingdom trembles. Still, one must ask, if the world shook in fear at the voice of the peasant, what might happen when that voice is joined by townsmen, traders, and thinkers with pens sharper than swords? By the time the fires of the Jacquerie had been extinguished and the blood had dried in the village commons, the ruling classes of France had learned something they would never forget. The peasantry could rise. Not successfully, not sustainably, but they could rise. The Jacquerie of 1358 did not change France's laws. It did not usher in equality. It did not win. Yet in its failure it left behind something more enduring than victory, a warning. This final section explores how the Jacquerie's legacy shaped the century that followed, how it echoed in the halls of power, in the minds of reformers and revolutionaries, and how it foreshadowed the end of feudalism not in a single strike, but in the long erosion of certainty. From rebellion to reform, one might imagine that such a violent uprising would trigger meaningful reforms, but medieval Europe did not work that way. In fact, after the Jacquerie, the immediate response was reactionary. Lords reasserted their rights. Courts issued rulings that reinforced feudal dues. Local officials tightened control, especially over grain, movement, and public assembly. But something had cracked quietly. In the decades following the Jacquerie, an increasing number of peasants and village communes appealed directly to royal courts for redress. They did not demand the end of the system. They demanded that the system function as promised. That dues be fair, that protection be provided, that justice not be the privilege of birth. In this shift from rebellion to petition lay the first flickers of political agency among commoners. Royal administrations, too, began to change. Kings, especially Charles V and his successor, sought to strengthen the monarchy not just through military might but through administrative reach. To do so, they needed allies not only among the nobles, but among merchants, townspeople, and rural notables. The very groups once crushed now became agents of centralization. And so, paradoxically, the Jacquerie's legacy was not eradication but integration. A few generations later, some descendants of those very rebels would be tax collectors, minor officials, even literate jurists. The revolt had failed to destroy the hierarchy, but it had exposed its weakness. Thread from silence to subversion. After 1358, the image of the compliant peasant began to fade from elite imaginations. In its place rose the fear of subversion. Suddenly, village festivals and nighttime gatherings were watched more carefully. Rumors of hidden weapons, secret alliances, and anti-noble sentiments haunted the countryside. In regions like Burgundy and Normandy, small local disturbances were met with disproportionate force. This fear was not irrational. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, Pockets of resistance continued to emerge, not grand revolts, but low-level defiance. Villagers refused to send men to serve in military levies. They falsified harvest figures to reduce taxation. They sheltered bandits who claimed to be fighting for the people. These were not organized revolutions, but chronic symptoms of unrest. The peasantry had learned that rising in arms could lead to death, but they had also learned that pressure, when applied persistently, could shift the boundaries of power. Cross the English Echo, Peasants, Revolt of 1381. Just 23 years after the Jacquerie, England faced its own rural uprising, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Though sparked by a different context, poll taxes, post-plague labor restrictions, and the failures of Richard II's government, it bore striking similarities. Marches on urban centers, London. Demands for the abolition of serfdom and fixed rents. Execution of officials seen as corrupt or exploitative. Brutal suppression followed by swift royal reassertion of power. But most importantly, both revolts were expressions of a shifting social reality. In both France and England, the rural underclass was beginning to perceive itself not merely as subjects, but as people with grievances, demands, and potential power. The Jacquerie did not cause the English revolt, but it laid the psychological and cultural groundwork for a broader European pattern of rural unrest. What once seemed unthinkable, a peasantry, aware of its collective interest, was now a recurring threat. Classical, the decline of the knight, the rise of the bureaucrat. One of the subtler consequences of the Jacquerie was its impact on the perception of the nobility. Before the revolt, the knight was seen as protector and leader. After, many nobles were viewed as absent, incompetent, or abusive. The revolt had revealed how little the rural aristocracy had done to defend their own lands or their dependents. Into this void stepped the royal administrator, tax agents, notaries, royal judges. These men were often of non-noble background, trained in law and loyal to the crown, not to any local hierarchy. Their presence in rural France signaled the shift from personal obligation to institutional authority. In this transformation, the revolt played a curious role. While it sought to destroy the elite, it accelerated the rise of a new kind of elite, one defined by literacy, legal power, and royal sanction rather than bloodline or sword. Scroll the memory of violence. Historical memory is rarely neutral. For centuries, the Jacquerie was invoked by the French nobility as a cautionary tale. This is what happens when order is questioned. This is what lies beneath civilization: fire, blood, envy. Manuscripts, chronicles, sermons, and even plays repeated the image of the peasant as a beast. This narrative justified harsh laws, repressive policies, and the preservation of noble privilege. But among the peasantry, the story was told differently, in whispers. It passed from generation to generation, not through books, but through folk tales, songs, and cautionary anecdotes. Not about revolution, but about betrayal, about the danger of hope, about what happens when the lowly forget their place, but also what happens when the mighty forget their duty. This tension between fear and remembrance infused rural consciousness with a new kind of political imagination. DNA seeds of the modern state. What does all of this mean for the broader theme of this series, decline of feudalism and the birth of the nation-state? The Jacquerie reveals that the decline of feudalism was not purely economic or administrative. It was also psychological. Lords no longer commanded blind obedience. Monarchy no longer relied solely on noble intermediaries. Peasants no longer viewed themselves as voiceless. These shifts did not immediately build a nation-state, but they undermined the pillars of feudalism. Personal loyalty as the basis of authority. Land-based power divorced from centralized law. rigid class roles enforced by custom and force. What replaced these pillars, slowly over generations? Legal codes, tax systems, armies loyal to the crown, local governance tied to the capital, not the castle. In this long arc, the Jacquerie is not just a violent interruption. It is a preludia shudder before a political earthquake. End arrow final reflections, when memory is a weapon. In the end, the Jacquerie did not end feudalism. It did not birth democracy. It did not triumph. But it revealed a truth that all rising states would have to contend with. That the governed are not always willing. That obedience is not endless. That even the most boring people peasants, farmers, plowmen can become agents of history when pushed far enough. Its legacy is complex, used by elites to warn, used by radicals to dream. And though the fields grew quiet again, and the manor houses rebuilt, and the church bells resumed their calm till something had changed forever in 1358. A door had been opened. And once opened, such doors do not easily shut. So we are left with a final question. If peasants could rise without plans, without weapons, and without Alice, what might happen when they finally learned to organize? Story 5. The Avignon Captivity, when the Pope became a political pawn. In the heart of 14th century Europe, amid war, famine, and plague, a quiet but seismic shift unfolded not on a battlefield, but in the corridors of power within the Church. In 1309, the Pope, with supreme spiritual authority of Christendom, left Rome and settled in Avignon, a modest riverside town in southern France. What followed would become known sometimes scornfully as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. For nearly 70 years, the seat of the Pope remained in Avignon, far from the Eternal City, entangled in French politics, wealth, and war. 7 popes ruled from this provincial enclave, not as distant holy fathers, but as deeply political operators caught between royal ambitions and ecclesiastical survival. This was not merely a relocation. It was a transformation of spiritual authority into bureaucratic dependency. We explore how the papacy came to Avignon, how it changed while there, and how this move foreshadowed the breakdown of medieval unity both politically and spiritually. Rome in ruin, the Church in crisis. By the late 13th century, the city of Rome was a shell of its imperial past, riddled with noble feuds, decaying infrastructure, and violent factionalism. It had become a dangerous and unstable place for any pontiff. Several popes had been forcibly removed or died in questionable circumstances. Bands of mercenaries and noble clans such as the Colonna and the Orsini vied for control over key neighborhoods. At times, the Pope required foreign soldiers just to walk from one basilica to another. Meanwhile, the papacy itself was facing pressure not just from the streets of Rome, but from the rising power of monarchs, particularly the kings of France. It was this tension between papal independence and royal ambition that triggered the crisis. Boniface VII versus Philip the Fair. The seeds of the Avignon papacy were planted during the reign of Pope Boniface VII, 1294–1303, and his infamous clash with King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair. Boniface, a firm believer in papal supremacy, issued a series of bulls asserting the Church's dominance over temporal rulers. The most explosive of these, Unum Sanctam, 1302, declared, "It is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff." Philip responded with fury. He accused Boniface of heresy, corruption, and even witchcraft. In 1303, his agents captured the Pope at Anagni in a shocking act of aggression. Though Boniface was soon released, he died weeks later humiliated and broken. This incident marked a turning point. It proved that kings could intimidate popes, and it set the stage for the next pontiff to seek safety and pliability in French territory. The move to Avignon. In 1305, after a year of deadlock, a Frenchman, Bertrand de Got, was elected pope as Clement V. He was a compromise candidate, a cautious man, and crucially willing to please King Philip IV. Rather than travel to the increasingly dangerous Rome, Clement chose to settle in Avignon, a papal possession nestled in the Comtat Venaissin, not technically part of France, but surrounded by French influence. There, in a town more known for vineyards than politics, the papacy dug in for the long haul. Building the bureaucracy. Avignon was not a grand city, but it became one quickly. Clement V and his successors transformed it into a papal capital. They built the Palais des Papes, a fortress-like complex with high walls, watchtowers, and vast meeting chambers. It was more castle than cathedral, reflecting the papacy's growing worldly concerns. With the Roman Curia now based in Avignon, the church bureaucracy expanded rapidly. Legates and notaries were dispatched across Europe. Financial offices tracked tithes and indulgences with increasing precision. Centralized tax systems allowed the church to extract revenue from even the most distant parishes. What had once been a spiritual institution became, under the Avignon popes, a highly efficient administrative machine. And yet, in becoming efficient, the church also became suspect. Money-bag accusations of corruption and French influence. Critics accused the Avignon papacy of being little more than a puppet of the French crown. All 7 popes who ruled from Avignon were French-born. The College of Cardinals became increasingly French-dominated. Decisions on bishoprics, political disputes, and financial matters often reflected French priorities. Meanwhile, the cost of administration skyrocketed. The Avignon papacy introduced or expanded several revenue mechanisms. Annats first-year profits from bishoprics. Papal provisions, fees for appointments. Indulgence sales, remissions of sin in exchange for payment. These practices generated enormous revenue, but also outraged reformers, who saw the church abandoning humility for gold. Petrarch, the great Italian poet and humanist, famously described Avignon as the Babylon of the West, a place of moral decay, greed, and intrigue. Globe showing Europe, Africa, a church entangled in worldly politics. From Avignon, the popes remained active in European politics but increasingly as power brokers rather than spiritual leaders. They negotiated treaties between kingdoms, excommunicated monarchs who defied papal authority, collected information on court disputes, succession claims, and military movements. This shift transformed the image of the Pope from shepherd to statesman, in the eyes of critics, an operator in silk robes. For kings like Edward III of England, the Avignon popes appeared too cozy with the French. During the early phases of the 100 Years' War, Edward viewed papal neutrality with deep suspicion, especially as the popes condemned English aggression, but remained silent on French expansionism. The Church's role as moral arbiter was fraying. Firecracker seeds of schism and secularism. Even as the Avignon papacy expanded its reach, it sowed the seeds of future crises. Local resentment grew as national churches, particularly in England, Germany, and Italy, resented papal taxation and appointments. Calls for reform emerged, emphasizing the need to return the papacy to Rome and focus on pastoral duties. The idea of national churches began to take root, foreshadowing later breaks with Rome. By prioritizing administration and proximity to France, the popes alienated other Christian polities. The illusion of a universal church, untethered from worldly borders, began to fade. And with that loss came a dangerous vacuum. Hourglass dunned the pressure to return. As the 14th century wore on, the pressure to return the papacy to Rome intensified. Pilgrims, reformers, and political leaders argued that the spiritual center of Christianity could not remain in exile. Rome, despite its chaos, was still symbolically central. Pope Gregory XI, the last Avignon pope, ultimately agreed. Urged by Saint Catherine of Siena, he returned the papal court to Rome in 1377. But the damage had been done. Within a year of Gregory's death, a disputed conclave led to the election of two rival popes in Rome, one in Avignon, each claiming legitimacy. This marked the beginning of the Western Schism, 1378–1417, a period where Europe was divided between competing popes, each with their own courts, policies, and armies. It was the spiritual equivalent of civil war. And it was born in part from the long entanglement of the papacy with French power, gold, and ambition in Avignon. End arrow. Final reflections: the captive and the kingdom. The Avignon papacy did not fall. It migrated, expanded, and eventually splintered. It marked the beginning of the end for medieval religious unity. It exposed the vulnerability of spiritual authority to temporal influence. It built systems that, while efficient, lacked soul. In becoming a tool of politics, the papacy lost some of its sacred mystery. And in that loss, it contributed quietly, but profoundly, to the decline of the old world. Feudalism was already waning. Monarchs were rising. But now even the Pope could be seen not as vicar of Christ, but as a man with a ledger, a garrison, and a foreign accent. And so we end this section with a question not of kings or battles, but of faith itself. If even the Pope can be made a political pawn, what hope remains for the unity of a divided Christendom? As the 14th century advanced, Avignon was no longer merely a temporary papal seat. It was the beating heart of church administration, a spiritual capital in everything but name. From its walls, the Pope reigned not with a sword or staff, but with an ink quill and a wax seal. The Church, once seen as transcending politics, now resembled a continental empire administered, taxed, and bargained like any royal domain. In this section, we trace the rise of papal bureaucracy, the dynamics of the French-dominated College of Cardinals, and how these changes redefined the papacy's authority, sometimes strengthening it, but often at great cost. Avignon as a political capital. By the time of Pope John XXII, 1316–1334, the second Avignon pope, the papal court had matured into a grand administrative apparatus. Avignon itself transformed. The small town became a fortified city with new walls, widened streets, and expanded merchant quarters. Traders, scribes, and foreign dignitaries poured in. Wine, silks, spices, and vellum moved through its streets as frequently as pilgrims and priests. But the city also became a court of political theater. Ambassadors from every major European kingdom came to petition or curry favor. Clerical careers were launched or destroyed by subtle intrigues within the papal palace. Public displays of wealth, banquets, relic processions, vestment ceremonies were used to project divine authority, even as whispers of corruption grew louder. The popes no longer roamed. They ruled stationary but not passive, presiding over a continent from a desk lined with ledgers and sealed envelopes. Abacus. The rise of papal finance. Papal revenue streams in Avignon became both innovative and controversial. The church had always relied on tithes, but Avignon's curia made fundraising into an art form. Key mechanisms included annates. The first year's income from any new bishop or abbot went directly to the papacy. Servitia communia, fixed fees that bishops and abbots had to pay upon confirmation of office. Papal provisions, the pope's right to appoint individuals to benefices, often in exchange for donations. Indulgences, payments in exchange for time off purgatory. sometimes sold in bulk or as part of crusading campaigns. Clerics across Europe resented these impositions. Many viewed them as a taxation without pastoral justification, a system that enriched the papal court while impoverishing parishes. Even loyal believers began to murmur, was salvation being sold? Man, the College of Cardinals, power in the shadows. While the Pope stood as the singular figure of authority, the College of Cardinals functioned as a kind of papal Senatian, increasingly powerful one. During the Avignon years, the college became more centralized, more homogeneous, and more politically shrewd. By the 1330s, over 90% of cardinals were French-born. Many were drawn from noble or courtly families, particularly those aligned with the French monarchy. The Pope often elevated cardinals who had served in administrative roles, prioritizing legal knowledge and political loyalty over spiritual acumen. This system created an insulated elite, one increasingly disconnected from the spiritual needs of the broader church. The cardinalate became a pathway for ambitious clerics, and Avignon a nexus of ecclesiastical patronage. A bishop in Germany or England knew his future might depend less on local needs than on approval from distant cardinals with French loyalties. Bow and arrow entanglements with France, the 100 Years' War. Perhaps no episode illustrates the political tightrope of the Avignon papacy better than the 100 Years' War, 1337–1453. As England and France locked into a brutal, protracted conflict, the popes in Avignon faced a dilemma. Open support for France would confirm fears of papal partiality. Support for England risked severing ties, with the very monarchy protecting their territorial seat. In practice, the Avignon popes attempted a policy of measured neutrality, but the optics were poor. Papal bulls condemning English aggression were issued more frequently than those condemning the French. Cardinals with strong ties to the French court advised on key matters. English clerics complained that papal appointments favored French loyalists, even in English dioceses. This perceived bias helped fuel a growing anti-papal sentiment in England, planting seeds for later calls for reform, even outright separation from Rome. What began as political entanglement slowly became a spiritual liability. Writing critics from within, Catherine of Siena and Petrarch. Not all critics of the Avignon papacy came from kings or scholars. Two of its most eloquent detractors were a poet and a mystic. Francesco Petrarca, Petrarch, the humanist and father of Renaissance thought, famously derided Avignon as a sewer of vice, the shame of Christendom. To Petrarch, the city symbolized the decay of true spiritual purpose, replaced by gold, courts, and political games. Saint Catherine of Siena, a Dominican tertiary and mystic from Italy, took a more direct route. She wrote pleading letters to Pope Gregory XI, urging him to return to Rome. Be a manly man, do not fear, but act with courage, for God is with you. Her appeals carried spiritual weight. They represented a growing desire among the faithful for a simpler, more authentic papacion rooted in humility and proximity to the flock. When Gregory XI finally returned the papal court to Rome in 1377, it was in part due to Catherine's moral pressure, combined with political unrest in France. Firecracker, the schism that followed. Tragically, the return to Rome did not heal the Church. Instead, it ushered in a worse crisis. The Western Schism, 1378–1417. In a chaotic conclave after Gregory's death, the Roman mob demanded an Italian pope. Urban VI was elected, but his erratic behavior alienated the cardinals. Within months, many of them fled Rome and declared his election invalid. They convened a new conclave and elected Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Now Europe faced two popes, each with a full court, a college of cardinals, and a claim to legitimacy. France, Scotland, and parts of Spain supported the Avignon line. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy recognized the Roman Pope. This schism shattered the illusion of church unity. For 4 decades, Christendom lived in spiritual confusion, mass, confession, and absolution granted by rival popes. The very fabric of papal authority had unraveled, a consequence, in part, of the long Avignon experiment. Book's bureaucracy versus belief. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Avignon papacy was the evolution of church governance. The popes of Avignon built a system that could collect money, appoint officials, and regulate doctrine across borders. Yet this same system became impersonal, alienating, and deeply vulnerable to accusations of corruption. In its drive to modernize, the Church had inadvertently alienated the faithful. It offered indulgences instead of grace, appointments instead of shepherds, taxation instead of guidance. The gap between administration and devotion widened, a gap that reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia would soon attempt to close, often at great personal cost. End arrow. Final reflections. When faith is administered. The Avignon captivity is not merely a tale of relocation. It is a story of institutional transformation, of how spiritual authority can become a function of political geography and economic necessity. For 7 decades, the Pope lived outside Rome. But more than his body, his authority had shifted from shepherd to sovereign, from servant to manager. The Church survived the Avignon years, but not without damage. And so we end this section with a quiet, unsettling question. When the voice of the shepherd is replaced by the ledger of the tax collector who, then, leads the flock. By the early 15th century, the papacy was no longer simply an exilate, was in crisis. For nearly 70 years, the popes had ruled from Avignon. The move, once seen as pragmatic and temporary, had grown into an institutional habit, entrenched by politics and bureaucracy. But what the popes had gained in safety and administrative expansion, they had lost in legitimacy. The Avignon period, climaxing in the Western Schism, left the Catholic Church fractured, discredited, and dangerously close to collapse. In this final section, we trace the aftermath of the Avignon captivity, the struggle for reunification, the rise of conciliar reform, and how the memory of this exile influenced the slow march toward modernity and ultimately the end of feudal Christianity as it had been known. The road to reunification. The Western Schism, 1378–1417, was not simply a bureaucratic error. It was a continent-wide spiritual rupture. 2 popes in Rome, one in Avignon, claimed divine legitimacy. Each excommunicated the other. Each appointed rival bishops. Each sought allegiance from Europe's monarchs. This chaos created a spiritual vacuum. Ordinary Christians were left to ask, if 2 men call themselves the Vicar of Christ, which one holds the keys to heaven? Theologians and secular rulers alike understood that this division threatened the foundation of the Church. The solution would come not from Rome or Avignon, but from a conciliar gathering of prelates, scholars, and princes determined to restore order. In 1409, the Council of Pisa attempted a fix. Both existing popes were declared illegitimate, and a new pope, Alexander V, was elected. But the old popes refused to step down. Now, the Church had 3 popes. A final effort came with the Council of Constance, 1414–1418. Here, under pressure from the Holy Roman Emperor and supported by a wide swath of the clergy, a compromise was forged. All rival popes were deposed or resigned. A new pope, Martin V, was elected in 1417. The papacy was permanently returned to Rome. The Avignon line was extinguished, but its influence would echo for generations. Classical: the rise of conciliarism. The councils that ended the schism also introduced a powerful idea. The authority of the Church does not lie solely in the Pope but in the collective body of the faithful, as represented by ecumenical councils. This was the doctrine of conciliarism, the belief that councils can overrule popes, especially in matters of reform and crisis. It was a radical break from centuries of papal supremacy, born directly from the failures of the Avignon period. Conciliarism gained traction throughout the 15th century. Reformers argued for regular councils. Some theologians envisioned a constitutional church, with checks and balances. Even monarchs began invoking conciliar ideas to limit papal influence in national affairs. But the popes, especially Martin V and his successors, resisted. The Renaissance papacy would eventually reassert central authority, but the damage was done. Conciliarism revealed that the papal crown was not unshakable, and in that idea lay the seeds of even deeper changes to come. Brick's institutional legacy: what Avignon built. Despite the chaos, the Avignon papacy left behind a formidable infrastructure, and much of it endured. The College of Cardinals remained a central force in church politics, with clearly defined hierarchies and roles. The administrative reforms of Avignon became the model for future ecclesiastical governance, complete with financial offices, diplomatic corps, and legal codes. The centralized tax system, though deeply unpopular, allowed the Church to wield influence even in distant corners of Europe. Avignon taught the papacy that territorial sovereignty mattered. Spiritual authority alone could not preserve power. Going forward, the Church would increasingly act like a state among states, with property, embassies, and even armies. This bureaucratization would later make the Church both more durable and more alienating. It could survive war, schism, and even heresy, but at the cost of intimacy and spiritual warmth. Collision: prelude to the Reformation. The Avignon years did not cause the Protestant Reformation, but they did prepare the ground. The corruption, nepotism, and financial manipulation that flowered in Avignon continued into the Renaissance papacy, embodied most egregiously in figures like Alexander VI and Leo X. But more importantly, Avignon left behind a trail of disillusionment. A clergy that often served distant bureaucrats rather than their flocks. Parishioners who saw their tithe vanish into foreign coffers. Kings who resented papal interference in their political and legal systems. By the early 16th century, reformers like Martin Luther would take aim not just at theological abuses but at the entire architecture of church authority, much of which had been built or refined in Avignon. In Luther's fiery language about Rome as the New Babylon, one can hear an echo of Petrarch's old slurs against Avignon. The metaphorical exile of the Church had become, for many, a permanent fall. Whirled the Avignon ghost in a changing Europe. Though the papacy never returned to Avignon, the idea of a divided church would haunt European politics for centuries. In the age of religious wars, state churches, and colonial missions, the question that first emerged in Avignon, what is the rightful center of spiritual authority, remained unresolved. In France itself, the memory of Avignon lingered in the form of Gallicanism, the belief that the French crown had the right to limit papal influence within its territory. This idea would play a role in everything from the French wars of religion in the 16th century, the Edict of Nantes and toleration debates, the French Revolution's suppression of papal authority. Elsewhere, the old Avignon precedent would be used to justify state control of religion. If popes could serve kings once, why not again? Avignon thus became a historical justification for future attempts to nationalize, regulate, or marginalize the Church. The modern Echo, a quiet hill in southern France. Today, the Palais des Papes still stands in Avignon, a massive, echoing shell of stone, more fortress than basilica. Visitors walk its empty halls, read plaques, and admire faded frescoes. But for centuries, these walls were alive with scribes, singers, cardinals, and cooks. Deals were struck here, edicts issued, souls judged. The popes have long since returned to Rome. Yet something of the Avignon experiment lingers in the structure of the modern church, in its balance between pastoral care and institutional control, in its oscillation between spiritual guidance and political diplomacy, in its attempts to serve both heaven and history. End arrow. Final reflections. What Avignon revealed. The Avignon papacy did not end with fire. It ended with bureaucratic fatigue, with overreach, and with spiritual disappointment. It showed how power, once centralized, rarely returns to its earlier form without loss. It taught kings that popes could be pressured. It taught Christians that their spiritual leaders were human, calculating, fearful, and fallible. But it also revealed something else. That the church, like any institution, must choose between permanence and purity. It cannot easily have both. So we close this story not with a war, or a death, or a scandal, but with a question that reverberates still in the corridors of religious power. If spiritual authority requires worldly compromise to survive, does it survive as spirit, or only as shadow? Story 6. The Guilds of Europe, silent engines of the medieval economy. When people imagine medieval Europe, they often conjure images of kings and knights, castles and cathedrals. Rarely do they think of the men and women who made the shoes, tanned the leather, baked the bread, or struck the iron. Yet behind every grand hall and every soldier's armor was a craftsman, and behind every craftsman stood a guild. The guilds of Europe were not armies or governments. They were collectives, quietly regulating the pulse of urban life. These organizations dictated who could work, how goods were made, what prices could be charged, and what standards had to be upheld. In this first section, we'll explore the origins of these guilds, how they shaped the growth of towns, and how they created an entire parallel structure of power based not on birthright or arms, but on skill, ritual, and apprenticeship. The rise of the medieval town. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Europe began a long, uneven process of urbanization. As trade routes reopened, agricultural productivity increased, and populations slowly recovered from centuries of instability. Small settlements near rivers, crossroads, and castles began to swell. These towns, often founded around a single cathedral, monastery, or fortress, became centers of commerce and craft. They attracted merchants looking for buyers and warehouses, artisans hopping to sell their wares, peasants seeking freedom from manorial dues. Towns were different from rural manors or noble estates. Here, money, not fealty, was the primary currency. A man could, in theory, rise by his skill, not by his lineage. But such opportunity also created competition and chaos. Enter the guild. Hammer. What was a guild? A guild was an association of people engaged in the same trade or craft. Its primary purpose was mutual protection of standards, skills, prices, and livelihoods. Guilds generally fell into two broad categories. Craft guilds. These were composed of artisans, weavers, blacksmiths, coopers, shoemakers, masons, and more. Merchant guilds. These focused on regulating trade, managing markets, and ensuring commercial privileges. At their core, guilds were about regulation. They determined who could work in a trade by issuing licenses. They enforced quality standards, punishing those who cut corners. They set fixed prices for goods to prevent destructive undercutting. They organized training systems, most notably the apprenticeship model. Guilds also cared for their own, providing assistance to members in times of illness, death, or financial hardship. Many built hospitals, almshouses, or chapels. Some even sponsored local festivals or paid for town defenses. Scroll apprentices, journeymen, and masters. To become a master craftsman was a long, structured journey. Apprentice, usually a boy of 12 to 14, he would be sent to live with a master. There, he would receive room, board, and training, often in exchange for labor. The term could last 5 to 10 years. Apprentices were not paid. Journeyman, after completing an apprenticeship, the craftsman became a journeyman, from the French journée, meaning day, as they worked by the day for wages. Journeymen could travel, earn money, and practice the craft, but they could not open their own shop. Master. To become a master, a journeyman had to produce a masterpiece, a work judged by the guild to be of sufficient quality. He also needed to pay significant fees and, in some cities, own property. This system ensured rigorous quality control, but also limited entry to the higher echelons. In some towns, becoming a master was more about politics and connections than talent alone. Balance guilds and local power. As towns grew, guilds became key political actors. In cities like Bruges, Lübeck, Florence, and Cologne, guilds elected city councils, funded fortifications, negotiated with kings and bishops, and at times even led revolts. In Florence, for example, the powerful Arti Maguri, greater, included judges, merchants, and bankers ran the city's government for centuries. Even the Medici, Florence's most famous family, began as members of the Wool Merchant Guild before rising to political dominance. Some guilds also controlled access to trade secrets. The formulas for certain dyes, glass techniques, or metallurgical processes were closely guarded. Leaking such secrets could result in expulsion or worse. Church rituals, brotherhood, and faith. Guilds were more than economic institutions. They were cultural and religious communities. Most guilds had a patron saint, often linked to the trade. St. Crispin for shoemakers, St. Eligius for metalworkers, St. Luke for painters. Guild members celebrated feast days, attended mass together, and processed through towns in elaborate robes or uniforms. They often had altars in local churches, with artwork commissioned by or for the guild. These rituals served multiple functions: strengthening internal bonds, reinforcing a shared identity, legitimizing the guild's public presence. In an age when religious and social life were deeply intertwined, a guild was as much a moral fraternity as an economic one. Exclusion and control. But guilds were also gatekeepers, and not everyone was welcomed. Women were generally excluded from full membership, though some widows inherited shops and participated informally. Jews were almost always barred, due to both religious prejudice and legal segregation. Foreigners could work in a town, but often faced restrictions or higher fees. Even within the guild, favoritism and nepotism were common. Masters often chose apprentices from among their relatives or social class. A talented outsider might spend a lifetime as a journeyman, ever admitted to the inner circle. Guilds thus provided stability but also stifled competition, resisted innovation, and preserved social hierarchies under the guise of unity. Globe showing Europe-Africa guilds across Europe. The form and function of guilds varied widely. In England, guilds became deeply linked with towns and boroughs. Many eventually became livery companies, some of which still exist in London today. In Germany, especially in the Hanseatic League cities, merchant guilds formed powerful alliances across borders. In Italy, guilds were almost inseparable from politics. The Art della Lana, Wool Guild, in Florence managed vast parts of the city's economy and civic life. In France, royal authorities frequently clashed with guilds, attempting to control or absorb them into state structures. No two guild systems were alike, but all shared a commitment to regulating craft, protecting members, and preserving tradition. Candle Final Reflections. Cities built by calloused hands. By the close of the 13th century, Europe's cities pulsed with industry and hierarchy. Behind every church roof, every iron hinge, every barrel of ale was the invisible hand of a guild. They created order where none existed. They trained generations. They set prices, made contracts, paid taxes, and prayed together. They did not win battles or crown kings, but they built the towns that became the arenas for politics, revolution, and art. And so we end this section with a quiet question, tucked between cobblestones and shop signs. When history celebrates the mighty, who remembers the mason, the cooper, the weaver who labored without glory but built the world beneath their feet? In the last section, we examine how medieval guilds emerged from the cobbled alleys of growing towns and flourished in the shadows of cathedrals. But guilds were never content to remain behind the scenes. As the centuries passed, they grew bolder, more organized, and more powerful, taking their place in the very structure of civic authority. This section traces how guilds transitioned from simple trade collectives to major players in urban politics. In some cities, they became de facto governments. In others, they sparked revolts or negotiated with monarchs as equals. The tale of the guild is not just one of hammers and looms, it is also one of petitions, charters, council seats, and bloodless coups. Guilds as civic institutions. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many European towns had gained degrees of independence from feudal lords or bishops. These newly free cities needed systems of governance that were local, stable, and respected by the citizenry. In this vacuum, guilds stepped in. City councils were often filled with guild representatives. Mayoral offices were frequently held by guild elders or their appointees. Legal disputes were judged in guild-run courts for trade-related matters. Taxation and militia organization fell, in many towns, under guild purview. In essence, the guilds provided the organizational muscle of the medieval commune. Even where nobles or bishops retained power, guilds formed a powerful counterbalance, organized, wealthy, and deeply embedded in the local economy. Guild charters and legal power. Guilds did not operate in legal limbo. Most possessed formal charters, documents granted by monarchs, bishops, or municipal authorities. These charters gave guilds the exclusive right to regulate a trade within the town, the power to enforce standards, often backed by civic penalties, the authority to admit or expel members, legal recognition of their internal rules, symbols, and rituals. In some towns, guilds were literally the law, especially in cases involving contracts, fraud, or apprentice disputes. This created a dual system of justice, one civil, the other corporate. A butcher cheating customers might face not only a civic fine, but also guild discipline, ranging from public shamming to full expulsion, which effectively meant professional death. Florence and the Guild Republic. No city better illustrates the political heights of guilds than Florence. By the late 1200s, Florence was governed by the Signoria, a rotating executive body selected from members of the Arti Maggiore, 7 most powerful guilds, which included the Calimala, cloth finishers and merchants; the Art della Lana, wool manufacturers; the Bankers' Guild; the Judges and Notaries. These guilds formed the backbone of Florentine republicanism. Entry into the political class required guild membership, and guilds fiercely guarded their privilege. Even the Medici, who would later rule as de facto monarchs, were bound by guild structures. Cosimo de' Medici held office by virtue of his position within the Art del Cambio, money changers. Florence was not unique. In many northern Italian cities, Siena, Pisa, Guilds served as both civic institutions and private associations. Their banners flew during parades, elections, and battles. Black flag revolts and uprisings. But power breeds conflict, and guilds were not always united. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, many cities witnessed guild revolts. These often came from lesser guilds or unguilded workers demanding inclusion or better representation. Raised Fist, the Ciampi Revolt, Florence, 1378. Perhaps the most famous was the Ciampi Revolt, when wool-carders unguilded laborers in the textile industry rose up, seized control of Florence, and briefly established a people's government. Their demands were simple: the right to form their own guild, political representation, relief from crushing debts. For a short time, the Ciampi even occupied the Palazzo Vecchio, the city's town hall. But their rule was short-lived. The established guilds, alarmed by this democratic fervor, crushed the revolt and reasserted control. Still, the Ciampi left a legacy, a reminder that guilds, for all their solidarity, were also gates and fences, keeping many laborers out of the political process they claimed to uphold. Crossed guilds and urban defense. Guilds were not just political or economic bodhisthi, also had a military role. In times of war or siege, guilds organized civic militias. Each guild often had its own armory, banner, and trained cohort of men. Defense of the city walls was sometimes assigned by guild. This role gave guilds a unique position, armed power independent of noble retinues. In cities like Ghent, Liege, and Cologne, guild militias were crucial in resisting both external invasion and internal aristocratic overreach. This ability to mobilize both workers and weapons made guilds indispensable and danger-roused urban lords and monarchs alike. Thread gender and the limits of participation. As guilds became political entities, their rules around inclusion became more rigid. Women, in particular, were largely excluded from formal membership in most high-status guilds. And yet, women were everywhere in the medieval urban economy. Alewives brewed and sold beer. Spinners and weavers worked in cottage industries. Midwives and healers offered essential services. Widows of masters sometimes inherited workshops. In many cities, women formed informal networks or craft groups, but these lacked the legal protections and privileges of the guilds. The boundary was clear. Economic labor was tolerated, but corporate and political power was restricted. Exceptions existed. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, women's guilds did form especially in textiles, brewing, or embroidery, but these remained rare and often subordinate. Package the Hanseatic League, guilds on a continental scale. While most guilds were local, some reached across borders. The Hanseatic League, founded in the 12th century and reaching its height in the 14th and 15th centuries, was a federation of merchant guilds from over 200 cities in northern Europe, from London to Novgorod. The League negotiated treaties with kings and emperors, maintained its own fleet, imposed trade embargoes, operated contours, trading posts across the Baltic and North Seas. Though not a single guild, the League functioned with guild-like principles, shared codes, mutual protection, and strict internal discipline. Its rise showed that the power of guilds could extend far beyond city walls, influencing international politics, diplomacy, and war. Chart decreasing the limits of guild power. By the late 15th century, the golden age of guild political power was beginning to fade. Several factors contributed. Monarchies were centralizing, bringing towns under tighter control. The rise of mercantile capitalism introduced business models that bypassed guild systems. Technological change, like the printing press, introduced trades too new to be fully regulated. Population pressures and urban growth made guild membership harder to police. Guilds resisted change, often doubling down on restrictions and internal hierarchies. But this rigidity made them vulnerable to irrelevance in a world that demanded flexibility. Still, for centuries, they had shaped the very nature of political life in medieval towns quietly, steadily, and profoundly. End arrow final reflections. The rule of the invisible hand before capitalism. Guilds were not democracies, nor were they tyrannies. They were something subtler, networks of influence built on shared interest and tradition, negotiating with the broader forces of power. They showed that labor, when organized, could govern, that craft, when defended, could be as mighty as the sword, that towns, when led by artisans, could rival courts and castles. And so we end this section with a simple question. When rulers sit on thrones and priests at altars, who holds the city's reins in quiet hand stained with ink, sweat, and the dye of the cloth they weave? In the bustling streets of a late medieval town, the sound of hammers, looms, and chisels once echoed through every narrow lane. These were the sounds of guilds in motion, of apprentices learning, of journeymen perfecting, of masters overseeing. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, those sounds began to fade. One by one, the shutters closed on many of Europe's guild workshops, not suddenly, but gradually, as new forces emerged to shape the world. This final section explores the slow decline of the guild system, the forces that challenged it, and the surprising ways guilds continued to influence labor, trade, and urban life even after their formal power waned. We close with a meditation on legacy, how the past lives on in rituals, language, architecture, and ideology, even when its institutions are long gone. The long decline. The guild system did not collapse in a single moment. Its erosion was a centuries-long process, beginning in the late 15th century and continuing through the 18th and 19th centuries in various forms. Several interconnected developments weakened the foundations on which guilds stood. 1. The rise of global trade. With the age of exploration, new global markets and resources flooded into Europe. Spices from the Indies, silver from the Americas, cotton from India, porcelain from China. This global influx of goods created markets that outpaced local guild regulation. Merchants began trading across borders, importing and exporting goods at scales no local guild could control. The result: guild restrictions began to look provincial and outdated in the face of international capitalism. 2. Capitalism and the rise of the merchant class. Guilds were built on small-scale, face-to-face economies, but the 16th century saw the emergence of merchant capitalist investors who funded production at a distance. The putting-out system, or cottage industry, bypassed guilds entirely, using rural laborers to produce textiles outside of towns. Joint-stock companies, like the Dutch East India Company, introduced corporate models that dwarfed local guild economies. The emergence of banks, credit, and stock exchanges created financial systems beyond the reach of craft regulations. Guilds could not compete with these new forms of organizing labor and capital. 3. Absolute estates and centralized authority. Kings and emperors increasingly viewed guilds as obstacles to centralized control. In France, Louis XIV systematically curtailed guild powers in favor of royal bureaucracy. In Prussia and Austria, rulers sought to rationalize and regulate guilds, integrating them into state-run economic systems. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about individual liberty, free trade, and progress ideas that clashed with the restrictive, hierarchical nature of guild life. By the 18th century, many governments had either absorbed or abolished guild functions in favor of state-regulated industries and labor laws. 4. The Industrial Revolution. Perhaps the final blow came with industrialization. Factories replaced workshops. Mass production replaced handcrafted goods. Wage labor replaced apprenticeship and mastership. Guilds had no answer to the steam engine, the power loom, or the assembly line. Craftsmanship survived, but not as the central organizing principle of economic life. In the modern industrial world, speed and scale triumphed over tradition and ritual. Rituals that refused to die. Despite these changes, guild culture never completely disappeared. Many guilds evolved into new forms. In England, the livery companies of London continued as charitable foundations and ceremonial bodies, preserving traditions while adapting to modern civic life. In Germany, some guilds were absorbed into state-regulated craft chambers. In cities like Bruges, Antwerp, and Florence, old guild halls became museums, housing records, relics, and memories of a lost age. Even today, one can visit the Guildhall in London, the Scuol Grandi of Venice, or the Zunfthuiser in Zurich, and feel the echo of meetings, oaths, and silent calculations. Legacy: what guilds left behind. While the institutions may have faded, the guilds left behind deep imprints in law, labor, education, and even language. 1. Apprenticeship and vocational training. The idea of structured skill development through apprenticeship remains foundational in trade schools, union-based training programs, certification systems. In Germany, the dual education system combining classroom learning with workplace apprenticeships, a direct descendant of the medieval guild model. 2. Labor organization. Modern trade unions owe more than a little to guilds. Both are built on collective bargaining. Both seek to regulate wages and working conditions. Both offer support and solidarity to members. While unions arose in a different context focused on workers, rather than masters, they reflect the same impulse for mutual protection in the face of market forces. 3. Ethics, quality, and pride. Guilds instilled the idea that work is more than a commodity, that it is a calling, a craft, and a source of identity. This ethic lingers in professional associations with strict codes, e.g., lawyers, doctors, architects; in artisan movements that resist mass production; in small businesses that emphasize craftsmanship, tradition, and locality. The phrase guild quality may no longer exist, but the value it represented still resonates. A modern reflection: are we seeing a revival? In recent decades, there has been a renewed interest in guild-like models. The rise of the maker movement emphasizes handcrafted goods, workshops, and local production. Digital guilds in programming, design, and open-source communities have adopted forms of apprenticeship, mentorship, and shared standards. In the face of globalized labor, there's a growing hunger for community-rooted economies, with cooperative ownership, shared knowledge, and mutual aid. In some ways, the digital artisan of Tade collaborating online, selling through niche platforms, building communities of practice resembles the medieval craftsman more than the 20th century industrial worker. Perhaps the guild, long buried, is stirring again in new forms, facing new challenges. End arrow. Final reflection: the quiet power of organized skill. We often think of history as the story of kings, empires, revolutions, and wars. But history also lives in the quiet work of skilled hands: the shoemaker's last, the mason's chisel, the weaver's loom. Guilds were not glamorous, they were not fast, they were not revolutionary, but for centuries they held the city together, binding people in networks of trust, habit, and shared endeavor. In a world that increasingly prizes speed, novelty, and scale, the story of the guild offers a reminder. There is dignity in continuity, and strength in slow, deliberate craft. And so we close the tale of the guild not with a final act, but with a question. As we race forward into an age of automation and fragmentation, who will speak for the patient laborer, the cautious master, the weary journeyman whose hands still remember how to shape the world?